Hey everybody, welcome. I am so glad to be back streaming with all of you. Wow, it's been a while, but I'm back. So glad to be here. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We have plenty to talk about here tonight. It's going to be awesome. And away we go.
I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome. So glad to be here. So glad to be back with all of you. We had an amazing Center for Political Innovation conference, the Summit Against Hypocrisy, that just happened a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C. That was absolutely tremendous. We just recently had a very successful number of street actions. CPI confronted Tsai Ing-wen, the fake leader of Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. Wow, I've got a new book that is now available. Where is America going? It's great. I'm going to be on some shows to talk about this book and the analysis it puts forward. That's happening. I mean, wow, so many great things are happening. And it's important to be thankful for these great things because we're doing our part. The world is moving in a very dangerous direction. The economy is not doing too well. The global situation is becoming more intense. And so all of us who understand the truth and understand why the struggle for justice is so important, we have to do our best. And I'm glad that CPI has been able to accomplish so much. The Center for Political Innovation. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, the way we do these live streams is I give my opening remarks, and during the opening remarks, I am writing down people's super chat questions. We already have one super chat that came in before the thing started. It was from Gavin. I wrote it down. That'll be the first one. And while I give my opening remarks, which tonight will be pretty substantial, but who knows? While I give my opening remarks, I write down super chat questions. So if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, shoot me a super chat. Then, after the opening remarks are finished, I give the roll call, where I call you all out as I see you, names and locations, and we find out who it is on the other side of the camera who's watching this. And right now, we are on 3 different platforms. We are on YouTube, we are on Facebook, and we are on Rockfin. Later, this will be uploaded to Rumble, and we'll be on Rumble. This will also be on Odyssey afterwards. So, we find out who it is who's watching live on the other side of the camera. We do the roll call. And after we do the roll call, then I answer super chat questions for the rest of the night. So if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, send me a super chat. I will write it down and I will do my best to give you an answer. That is the way the show here works. So yeah, plenty of great things to talk about. Couple quick announcements. One big announcement to make is that it is time to join the Center for Political Innovation. We just had a great conference in Washington, D.C. We have members meetups happening around the country. We've got study groups and reading groups happening. And now is the time, if you have been on the fence, now is the time to join the Center for Political Innovation, to join the CPI. I will be dropping the link in the chat to join the Center for Political Innovation. But, we're doing great stuff. Our president, Elizabeth, is running our Saturday meetings. We have reading groups. We have new books being published. Now would be a great time to become a member of the CPI. So you can do that. The second thing I want to mention is that today there was a Discord server created for the CPI. That Discord server does not represent CPI. We will never use that app in any official capacity. Now, I understand it's been taken down, but regardless, if any future anything shows up on Discord, that does not represent CPI. That app is notoriously unhealthy. Every experience I've ever had with Discord has been negative to some degree or other. So if somebody tries to get you to join a Discord server or claims that CPI, is functioning on Discord or something like that, we do not use Discord. And so anything you see on Discord does not represent CPI. And that's really, really important. So be aware of that. It does not represent the CPI. We don't use Discord. We do not use Discord. Discord is not the app that we use. So just want to be absolutely clear about that. So with no further ado, I'm going to jump in tonight. My opening remarks for tonight. How are we doing on audio? Let's make sure the audio is hooked up. Yeah, we should be good. All right. Just going to jump into my opening remarks for tonight. Folks, as I mentioned before, we're in an economic crisis as a country. We're in a long-term crisis of overproduction. The computer revolution has drastically reduced the role of the worker in production. So the ever-present problem of the worker not being able to buy back the product he produces is exacerbated. The financialization of our economic system has escalated. The driving down of living standards and the globalization of production, all of this is culminating in a long-term capitalist crisis. And as a result, the Western countries, the centers of the global financial imperialist system, are coming apart. So I've been thinking about this capitalist crisis that we are facing. And obviously it's manifesting itself in an escalation of hostility toward Russia and China. It's escalating, and we're also seeing domestically a huge drive to decrease living standards. We're seeing the rise of a low-wage police state. And at the same time, we are seeing increasing division among the ruling class. Different sections of the ruling class are fighting against each other. And I wrote an entire book, Where is America Going?, explaining the roots of the crisis, explaining why the capitalists are fighting amongst each other, the different factions, where this will eventually go. And I've written this whole book about it. But on tonight's stream, I want to talk about something else because I've been processing in my mind, thinking about the capitalist crisis that we're living under. And I'm doing a chess game in my head, and I'm running scenarios. If you're playing chess, and I'm not very good at chess, I'll admit, but if you're playing chess, you have to think, okay, if I move here, then he might move here, right? When you're playing chess, it's a game of anticipation, thinking what might happen. And so I'm running scenarios in my head, and I'm trying to figure out how do we get the 1920s? How do we get the 1950s? How do we get the 1980s? Because I look at the three previous crises that American capitalism has been in, and each of them was resolved to some degree or other. Each of them, we got some kind of new normal out of them. And I'm going to, on this stream, talk about the three crises that we had in the 20th century. There were three crises of capitalism, revolutionary crises, the crises that had revolutionary potential. And each time the ruling class was able to maneuver and restore some kind of normality. It was short-lived, but some kind of normality emerged out of these crises. And so I'm going to go over those three crises, and we're just going to talk about what happened in all three of those crises. So there we go. I'm going to write this down. Besides demonstrating against pension reforms, what do you believe the French are also protesting? You believe the French are also protesting NATO and the Ukraine war? All right. Very good. Wrote it down. So let's talk about the three crises that existed, because that is what's on our minds. The ruling class is sitting there and they're thinking, how do we get the 1920s? How do we get the 1950s? How do we get the 1980s? How do we maneuver out of this crisis to get society back in order, to get imperialism to be an ascendancy once again? How do we beat down the oppressed countries that are breaking out and fighting for national liberation? How do we stabilize the imperialist homelands? That is what the imperialists are thinking about right now. And so let's just talk about the last three crises. The first crisis we'll talk about was in the lead up to World War I. At the turn of the century, 1900, there was a huge Marxist movement. It was a massive Marxist movement. In Germany, it was the biggest. You had the German Social Democratic Party. In Britain, you had the Labour Party. In France, you had the socialist groups. Many parts of the world, and including the United States, you had a big socialist movement. In the United States, the socialist movement was led by a guy named Eugene Debs. And Eugene Debs almost got 1 million votes in the 1912 election. He got over 900,000 votes. And he traveled around the country on a red train car, rallying the people for socialism. You had the American Federation of Labor, which was a reformist labor union, and then you had the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, that were the radical revolutionary labor union. You had a lot of immigrants coming to the United States from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Ireland. You had, the factories in the urban centers, the steel mills, the packing houses, where a lot of people were paid poverty wages to work in industry. And you started to have a crisis. 1912, Eugene Debs got 900,000 votes, and socialism was increasingly becoming popular. The Wobblies were leading militant strikes, and the capitalist market was having frequent panics and meltdowns. And as the crisis intensified, as the protests of the working class got stronger, and as the divisions in the ruling class and the chaos on the market got bigger, there emerged in the United States a Bonapartist figure named Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson became president in 1912, and he was very much a Bonapartist, selected by the Eastern establishment. He came out of Harvard, I believe. He was a Harvard professor of political science. He had been groomed by the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Carnegies, and he was brought into power to try and stabilize capitalism and to use his expertise as a political science professor, as somebody who was trusted by the old money New England elite of the United States, someone who was trusted by the British Empire. He was brought in with the understanding that he would come to power and stabilize capitalism. And he was brought in to do that. And the 1912 election was a wild election, because you had Woodrow Wilson, who was the Democrat candidate for president, who won. And there was a huge cult of personality created around him. He was seen as a progressive. It was said, this guy is just so smart. He's a Harvard professor. He's studied political science. He's a progressive, and he's going to get rid of child labor, and he understands science and modern thinking. He's this brilliant Harvard professor who's going to come in and save the day. Woodrow Wilson was a lot like Barack Obama. He was the Barack Obama of 1912. There was a capitalist crisis that was happening, and Woodrow Wilson was going to save the day. It was a new day in America. He was going to save the day. However, in addition to Woodrow Wilson, the ruling class was also very afraid of Eugene Debs, because Eugene Debs was a socialist and a revolutionary who represented, a revolutionary working class movement that was gaining momentum. So Teddy Roosevelt ran for president also. Theodore Roosevelt started his own party, and it was called the Bull Moose Party. And the Bull Moose Party ran as a weird, semi-populist, but very racist and very imperialist party that was formed. And it was called the Bull Moose Party. And the Bull Moose Party wanted to reassert American dominance over the globe. It was very much in favor of U.S. military interventions around the world. It played up the idea that Theodore Roosevelt and his infamous White Fleet, that Navy ships that had colonized the world, was very effective. It was also very racist. But Theodore Roosevelt, he did include in his platform for the Bull Moose Party the idea they would expropriate the capitalists. They would have some vague form of socialism. It was almost like a vague social democracy mixed in with its very, very racist and pro-imperialist platform. And Lenin wrote a very important essay analyzing the 1912 presidential election in the United States, and said that the Bull Moose Party had been created to take votes away from Debs. It was very clear that Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party, they were the main revolutionary party. And it was very clear that that this Bull Moose Party that was created by former President Teddy Roosevelt, that had vaguely socialist language but was very pro-imperialist, it was created to take votes away from Debs. And then you had Eugene Debs, and Eugene Debs, ran for president, preaching socialist revolution, preaching a new America for working families. Eugene Debs was just an amazing person. If there's ever been a dynamic revolutionary in American history, it was Eugene Debs. So. Wrote it down, and that's like, if you have a super chat you want me to answer in the second half of the show, send me a super chat. But anyway, and let's get rid of this person. Let's get rid of that person. All right, very good. So 1912, you had the Eastern establishment selecting Woodrow Wilson as their Bonapartist figure who was going to come into office and stabilize capitalism. And then on top of that, you had Theodore Roosevelt and his Bull Moose semi-populist movement that he created. You had Eugene Debs and the Revolutionary Socialist movement. So Woodrow Wilson came into office and was trying to some degree or other to stabilize capitalism. Now, one of the main things that Woodrow Wilson believed in was eugenics. Woodrow Wilson was a staunch white supremacist and eugenicist. He believed in that racial pseudoscience that has been debunked. He believed some races were superior to others. He passed all kinds of eugenics laws. He was doing everything he could to try and impose kind of an Eastern establishment Malthusian agenda. He was a big supporter of birth control being legalized. He wanted poor people to have less children. He was an Eastern establishment guy. That was Woodrow Wilson. But he was up against the urban political machines of the Democratic Party, and he was up against the Republicans. The Republicans tended to represent the Midwestern states, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, places like that, where you had capitalists that were not part of the Eastern establishment, that were not part of the club, kind of like now, right? I mean, just like now, it seems like the Republican Party is largely the party of lower level capitalists. It was then as well, and it was the party of the Midwest. And at the same time, in the urban centers, you had the political machines. In New York City, you had Tammany Hall, which was the New York City bureaucracy, notoriously corrupt, but it was largely Roman Catholic, a lot of Italians, a lot of Irish folks, and it was also it was very nepotistic, and it was all about handing out the goods. And it was the early civil servants, the fire departments that were being formed, etc. And the urban political machines fought against Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's support largely came from the South. It was the solid South. That's where the Democrats got their support from. They used to call it the solid South. It was the Jim Crow South. It was the South where black people weren't allowed to vote and couldn't drink out of the same drinking fountains. And the Jim Crow South really gave its solid support to Woodrow Wilson. The Midwestern states were largely Republican, and the Democratic Party of the urban centers of Philadelphia, Cleveland, Pittsburgh was run by these urban political machines that were largely Roman Catholic. Woodrow Wilson wanted to stabilize capitalism. So what Woodrow Wilson did was he created a right-wing mass movement to try and be his foot soldiers to stabilize capitalism. He went to Hollywood, which was new back then. Movies were a very new thing. There had never been a full-length movie ever made, but he went to a filmmaker in early Hollywood, D.W. Griffith, and he had this filmmaker make a propaganda film. And it's the first full-length film in history. It's a film called The Birth of a Nation. And The Birth of a Nation was this white supremacist propaganda film that Woodrow Wilson basically commissioned. I mean, he went to Hollywood and they showed quotes from Woodrow Wilson on the screen as captions. He screened it at the White House and had a special press event. And he said he wanted all Americans to watch The Birth of a Nation. And the film, The Birth of a Nation, was an attack on the Republican Party. It was basically saying that the Republican Party, by trying to do Reconstruction, by trying to give black people equal rights in the aftermath of the Civil War, had betrayed the white race. And it was an attack on the Republican Party. The film actually shows Lincoln being shot as if it's a glorious event. The film is an exercise in historical revisionism, an attempt to say the South was right in the U.S. Civil War. And it portrays the Ku Klux Klan as heroes, the Klansmen who fought against the Union Army during Reconstruction. In the film, they're portrayed as heroes. At one point, they ride in on their horses and they play the Ride of the Valkyries. It was a silent film, but they're playing the bum ba dum bum 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 ba dum bum 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 ba dum bum 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 ba dum bum when the KKK is riding in. And it was a propaganda film. And, back then, people had not ever seen movies before. People had not ever seen movies. And so, they had not seen a movie before. And they were just, they were emotionally absorbed by this propaganda film to the point that, people would see this movie. They would show this movie in a city and the audience would just be so fired up with racial hatred, they would go murder a black person. It was just a disgusting racist propaganda film that was made, that Woodrow Wilson made it to fight the Republican Party, but also to fight the urban political machines. After the movie was made, I believe it was 1914, he made this movie, a couple of years into his administration. They then had a big rally in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and they restarted the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan was restarted as this mass white supremacist secret society fraternity, that would support the Democratic Party. And it was anti-Roman Catholic. It considered Catholics to be un-American, to be disloyal to the country, to be agents of a foreign power. They were loyal to the Vatican. They weren't real Christians, etc. And of course, it was against black people, and it was supporting Jim Crow segregation, and was saying that anyone who criticized Jim Crow should be murdered. And it was also against the Republican Party, because it said the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln that had betrayed the white man. They accused the Democratic Party of hiring black people in government jobs, which they considered to be a big crime. And the Ku Klux Klan was revived by Woodrow Wilson as his Bonapartist, counter gang, if you want to call it that. It was his group of brown shirts in white sheets who went around pushing Woodrow Wilson and the Eastern establishment's agenda. They were against Roman Catholics. They were against the Republican Party. They were against black people having equal rights. They were in favor of eugenics and racial pseudoscience and Malthusianism. They believed that black people had too many children, and that was why the economic crisis was happening. And it was a Bonapartist maneuver by Woodrow Wilson to try and stabilize capitalism. That was the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan, most of their propaganda focused on demonizing Roman Catholics, because Roman Catholics were the largest minority group at the time. That was who most of their propaganda focused on. They were also against labor unions, and they considered labor unions to be a Jewish conspiracy, a communist conspiracy against America. They were against Marxism, against labor unions. And the Ku Klux Klan, they conducted lynchings and assassinations and murders, and they were used to incite, violence against the Socialist Party. They were used to murder black people, and it was a Bonapartist maneuver by one faction of the ruling class. So that happened, and then 1914, around that time, World War I started in Europe. The Guns of August, August of 1914, World War I started. And World War I was a horrendous war. 20 million people died. More like 26 million, but at least 20 million soldiers. That doesn't include the civilians, so it was probably more than that. Died in this horrendous war. And the Socialist Party of the United States opposed it, to their credit. Now, a lot of members of the Socialist Party sold out and supported it, but Eugene Debs, he opposed the war. But the main reason that World War I happened was because the socialist movement in Europe sold out. The German Social Democratic Party, at the last minute, changed its position and supported the war. The French socialists, at the last minute, they supported the war. The British socialists, at the last minute, they supported the war. And all the social democrats, the social fakers, the social imperialists, all the big Marxist parties in Europe abandoned their principles and sold out and supported the war. However, the United States didn't get involved at first, right? The war started in 1914. The USA was not involved. The American people largely felt it was none of their business, that it was a European conflict, that there was nothing for the United States to gain. And in 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, and his campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." And that was the campaign slogan he used, and he plastered it everywhere. He kept us out of war. He said, "I am such a good leader. I managed to keep us out of this awful war that's happening in Europe." And Woodrow Wilson got elected on the platform of he was going to keep the American people out of war. And then, at that point, after he got reelected, about a year later, 1917, the United States got involved in World War I. And Woodrow Wilson flipped his position. And the U.S. joining World War I was no small measure. The U.S. Congress declared war, and that was a really big deal. Every young man was drafted to join the military. There were groups of people they had who patrolled the streets of the country looking for young men, right? And if there was anyone, a young man of fighting age, and he couldn't present a draft card, he was taken to jail for draft avoidance. Every young man was conscripted immediately. The Socialist Party was broken up brutally. Eugene Debs gave an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, and he was thrown in prison. Okay, writing it down. given an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio. He was thrown in prison. There were Supreme Court rulings, and the USA, in order to fight in World War I, the United States became a kind of a military dictatorship. I mean, there's no way around it. There was a Hollywood filmmaker, again, this is the era of silent movies, who was a patriotic guy. And he made a movie called The Spirit of 1776. And it was a patriotic movie to support the war, to support patriotism. And so he made this movie, The Spirit of 1776, and he was thrown in jail for making this movie because he portrayed the British as the bad guys. He showed the British in a negative light, so he hurt the war effort. So even this patriotic filmmaker, you can read it. It's one of the wildest stories I've ever read. Here, I'll shoot you the link. But they threw this guy in jail for making the movie The Spirit of 1776. It's insane. Spirit of 1776, 1917 film. Read the Wikipedia page. The filmmaker was thrown in jail for making it because he portrayed the British in a negative light. That's how intense the crackdown on freedom of expression was. That's how intense the crackdown on freedom of expression was. That's where the famous Supreme Court ruling about, if you've ever heard the phrase, shouting fire in a crowded theater. Schenck versus the United States. There was a socialist in New York City who was handing out leaflets outside the draft office, the induction center of the military. He was handing out leaflets saying, don't fight in the capitalist war. Don't fight on the boss's war. And he was arrested, and the Supreme Court said, he presents a clear and present danger with his speech because the country is at war. And the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, the two laws they are now using against Julian Assange, the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, those laws are now being used, against Assange, but they were passed by the Wilson administration. The head of the U.S. Department of Justice was Mitchell Palmer. And Mitchell Palmer became infamous for the Palmer raids right after the Russian Revolution, right? So World War I is happening. And then in Russia, you have the Russian Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution breaks out. And there was a panic in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. So Woodrow Wilson sent Mitchell Palmer and the Department of Justice, and they went and they rounded up anyone who wasn't a U.S. citizen who called themselves a communist or a socialist or an anarchist, rounded them up and deported them from the country. And thousands of people were rounded up. There were a lot of immigrants in the country at the time, who didn't have papers at the time. They were from Eastern Europe. They were from Italy. They were from Denmark, from Finland, from wherever. And they were rounded up and deported. And thousands of people were deported in the Palmer raids. It was a pretty horrendous thing that happened. The Palmer raids. And then, in addition to that, you had the you had the rise of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the he was just a congressional librarian at the time, and he lived with his mother, kind of a socially awkward guy. They say he may have been on the spectrum, kind of autistic. He began giving speeches to members of Congress about the evils of communism. And he became known as this really good speaker who was just an expert. He'd done a lot of reading and he knew all about communism and how bad it was. So Mitchell Palmer hired him at the Department of Justice, and he created the BOI, which was the Bureau of Investigation, which eventually became the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And it was this little wing of the Department of Justice that was kind of a cult of personality around J. Edgar Hoover that was specifically designed to go after communists. J. Edgar Hoover went after the very famous anarchist and feminist Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was this very well-known feminist and anarchist who was in New York City She had like a big following among kind of like middle class bohemian kind of people. You know, she went to jail for using birth control and stuff like that, and he got her deported from the country as a foreign-born communist sympathizer. You know, it was just a huge crackdown that happened amid the war. And all of this was happening, and, you know, millions of dollars were being spent on war, and mass destruction was happening in Europe. All right. And there you go. I mean, that was the situation. I think I'm going to mod some people. There's some people in the chat who ought to be mods. So there you go. I'm going to mod some people here just so they can keep order in the chat. But there you go. There you go. I just modded Noah, right? He ought to be a mod. You're now a mod, Noah. But there we go. So coming out of World War I, the Socialist Party had been crushed. The Socialist Party had been crushed first by the crackdown at the beginning of the war, and then by the Palmer raids. And then, in addition to that, you had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. That was like this Bonapartist group that was being used by Woodrow Wilson to push forward his wing of the ruling class. And in addition to that, you had a huge, ugly war in Europe where, you know, millions of people died, 20 million people died. And it had destroyed almost all of the European mainland. I mean, the fighting went on in France and in Germany and in the European heartland in Belgium. And so you had this mass destruction and death. And coming out of World War I, the crisis of capitalism was resolved. And the United States had not had the war on its own territory, had not been destroyed. So U.S. industries started booming because, you know, all the steel mills in Europe had been destroyed, but they were buying their steel from the United States now. So the USA started booming. What they call the Roaring 20s in the United States was very much a result of the fact that the capitalist crisis that preceded World War I had been resolved with all kinds of Bonapartist maneuvering, heavy political repression, and ultimately a big, huge, dramatic war that stabilized capitalism. Now, Woodrow Wilson stayed in office. And this is the funny thing about Bonapartist figures in American history is the ruling class, it needs them, but it can't stand them, because Woodrow Wilson had come into office as the authoritarian strongman they were looking for. He was this college professor from Harvard who was going to come in and save the day and stabilize capitalism. But he got in there and he did it, and he stabilized capitalism. And almost immediately after the war was over, he started to lose power. People started to see him as a dictator, as an authoritarian. One thing that he did was, with the Ku Klux Klan and the Republicans backing him up, he passed prohibition. He amended the U.S. Constitution to outlaw the drinking of alcohol, which was a disastrous policy. But that was part of his, you know, social engineering. He thought alcohol was not good, that people shouldn't be drinking alcohol. And so they outlawed drinking alcohol in the United States. So there you go. Okay. And that was one thing he got done. But when Woodrow Wilson was out of office, the Republicans kind of came into office, because suddenly, you know, the Bonapartism was over. You started to have class peace. In the 1920s, you started to have class peace again. And the Republicans came in, and, like, very famously, Warren G. Harding, the Republican president who came in, pardoned Eugene Debs. And it was part of the reconciliation that went on. And this Republican president pardoned Eugene Debs and met with him at the White House, invited him to the White House, and they just had a meeting, and he pardoned him, let Eugene Debs out of prison. And that was considered, it was like truth and reconciliation. The war is over. World War I's over. Let's let Eugene Debs, who is so loved by the labor movement and the working class, let's let him out of jail. And, you know, he's old now. He's not going to cause any problems. Let's let him out of jail and show that America has a place for radicals even. And it was like a publicity stunt. They pardoned Eugene Debs. They let him out of prison. And the other thing that happened was in 1924, the Democratic Party was clearly so messed up with the Ku Klux Klan that it couldn't function. The Democrats had their 1924 Democratic Party convention in Manhattan, and the Ku Klux Klan fucked everything up because what happened was that most of the Democrats wanted Al Smith. Al Smith was a party boss, a corrupt machine politician from New York City named Al Smith. Al Smith is just a really big, famous politician in New York City history. And he was a Democratic Party boss, and he was Catholic. He was a Roman Catholic. He was an Irish Catholic. And Al Smith is who the Democratic Party machine wanted. However, the Ku Klux Klan wanted a guy named McAdoo. I forget what his first name was. They wanted a guy named McAdoo. And so the Klan wanted this guy named McAdoo, who was kind of a populist, but was really anti-alcohol and really anti-Catholic. And the Democratic Party machine wanted Al Smith. And so the Democrat convention of 1924 went on for 13 days. 13 days straight, the Democrat convention went on because they could not agree on a candidate. The Ku Klux Klan essentially held the Democratic Party hostage. They called it the Klan Bake because it was in Madison Square Garden, was where the convention was. It was in New York City. And the Ku Klux Klan was there beating people up and threatening people. The Democrats could not pass a resolution condemning the Ku Klux Klan. They tried to pass a resolution for the Democratic Party condemning the KKK. They couldn't do it. The Klan would burn crosses every night. And as people walked out of Madison Square Gardens, they would see the burning crosses. And so as a result of the Democratic Party being held hostage by the Ku Klux Klan, the Ku Klux Klan was suddenly now demonized in American media. Before that, the Klan had been kind of treated as a respectable organization of, you know, whites and progressives or whatever. But obviously, at this point, if they were holding the Democratic Party hostage and the crisis of capitalism was no longer there, capitalism had stabilized, the U.S. media and the U.S. government began prosecuting Ku Klux Klan leaders. A number of KKK leaders were thrown in prison for misuse of funds or whatever. And ultimately, starting in 1924, the Klan, the U.S. government and the mainstream media stopped promoting the Ku Klux Klan. And basically, that was how they got over the crisis. Big, huge, dramatic war, big, huge crackdown on socialism. And you had the economic crisis of that preceded World War I, the Bonapartist struggle, in the ruling class. All of that got resolved. And you got the 1920s. And that's the premise of my live. I'm saying, how do they get the 1920s? How do they get the 1950s? How do they get the 1980s? How is the ruling class going to solve this one? So that's how they were able to resolve it. They crushed the Socialist Party. They had a big, huge war that resolved the economic problems with all that destruction and solved the problem of overproduction. They cracked down on socialists. They had the Bonapartist maneuver, the Ku Klux Klan. That's how they were able to resolve the capitalist crisis. So that's how they resolved the crisis. That's how they got the roaring 20s, the 1920s. So let's go to the next capitalist crisis. Writing it down. So that's how they were able to resolve that capitalist crisis. So then Then you had the Roaring 20s. And during the 1920s, there was a really popular expression in the United States. They said, Ford has overtaken Marx. Henry Ford has defeated Karl Marx. Because they argued that Henry Ford had invented this new mechanism of capitalism that proved Marx's theories about overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, Marx's idea that capitalism was unsustainable. It had been debunked by Henry Ford, and that Fordism or Taylorism, these were two big ideas that were being promoted during the 1920s of a highly controlled capitalism. Fordism and Taylorism were said to be so efficient that Marxism was disproved. You could have a permanent capitalist prosperity. Prosperity would last forever. There would never be an economic crisis because of the fact that Ford and Taylor had invented new methods of making capitalism very sustainable. That was the idea. You know, and Henry Ford was notorious for regulating the lives of his workers, regulating their personal lives, mandating that they live certain ways. Taylorism was about, making assembly line production very, very efficient. And that's what it was argued. I know that Gramsci in his prison notebooks writes a lot about Fordism and Taylorism. And that it was all about making capitalist production as efficient as possible, but, paying the workers higher wages, than you would before, because they could buy more of the product that they produce back, pay them higher wages, but have them work in a way that is super, super efficient. Fordism was the big talking point in the 20s. And honestly, it reminds me of the 90s, because I remember during the 1990s, when I was a kid, I wasn't paying attention to things like I would now, but I heard the same crap. In the 90s, they were saying the computer revolution has proved that capitalism we're going to have permanent prosperity. In the 1990s, the dot-com boom, I heard the same crap. They were saying the same stuff, that the Soviet Union has fallen and now we're having an economic boom in the 1990s. And that proves that capitalism is just going to have a permanent economic growth, right? There's never going to be an economic downturn. And of course, anyone who knows anything about the laws of the market or the objective laws of history knows that that's not the case. But there was a big capitalist boom in the 1920s, and they said Ford has defeated Marx, just like in the 90s. They said Bill Gates has defeated Marx, right? And that they were going to have permanent prosperity. But then we know what happened. 1929, the stock market crashed. And you had the stock market crash in 1929. Huge economic downturn, huge unemployment. Workers, had their life savings at the bank, and the bank went bust and they lost all their money. That was a really common thing that happened back then, because back then there was no, FDIC. There was nothing like that at the time. And so if your bank went under, you lost all your money, right? And part of the reason that eventually Roosevelt passed the Glass-Steagall law was to make sure that private banks that held people's money were not gambling with that money on the stock market, because that was what happened to many, many working people. Many working people who worked in a factory or whatever, they would put their money in the bank, and the bank would then use their money to gamble on the stock market. And so when the Great Depression hit, Black Friday, 1929, when the stock market crashed, many, many, many people, thousands and thousands, if not millions of people, lost all their life savings. They'd been told all their life, you got to save. And then one day they went to the bank and their money was not there. And it was an absolute disaster. The factories laid off people by the thousands, and people were literally starving on the streets of the United States. And people don't seem to realize, but there were no social programs to speak of back then. There were no food stamps. There was no unemployment insurance. And people lost their jobs, and they were starving. And they were starving on the street. There were dead bodies found on the street of New York City all the time. Major urban centers would have dead bodies from starving people. That was really common. You'd have desperately poor people going from city to city in the Midwest. wandering workers. Everybody was used to, someone knocking on their door to beg for work. That was really common. If you had a house, almost every day someone would knock on their door, and they would knock on your door and say, can you pay me to do something? Can you feed me? I'll work for food. Do you want me to sweep your floor or something like that? I mean, it was a desperate situation. There were thousands and thousands of people that were homeless. There were thousands of people that were malnourished. It was a desperate economic situation. And it was an economic crisis. Now, the Communist Party of the United States was part of the Communist International, and the Communist International had predicted the economic crisis. This is really important. And if you want to really know your history, I recommend William Z. Foster. There's no better source on this than William Z. Foster. And William Z. Foster, he has this book called The History of the Three Internationals. And it is a history of the Marxist movement, the global Marxist movement, the history of the three internationals by William Z. Foster, the world socialist movement, world socialist and communist movements from 1848 to the present. And thank you for the super chat. I really do appreciate it. They predicted in 1928, a year before the stock market crashed, they had a Congress, the Sixth World Congress of the Communist International. And at that Congress, they declared the third period. They argued that first, there had been a period of upsurges and revolutionary upheavals at the end of World War I. You had the Russian Revolution that was successful. You had the Hungarian Revolution and the German Revolution that was crushed. You had the British General Strike. You had all these uprisings happening throughout Europe in the aftermath of World War I. But then after that, you had a period of capitalist stabilization, the Roaring '20s. And then they argued that they saw the beginning of the economic crisis. So in 1928, the Communist International said we are entering the third period. They called it the third period. And the third period was the period of revolution, and it was the period of the rise of socialism, they argued. And they said that in the third period, they argued, the main threat was social democrats, fake socialists. They were the main danger. And that every effort should be made to defeat the social democrats, who they called social fascists. And that was the focus. And there was a feeling that, they took what Lenin said about going lower and deeper to the real masses. They took it to heart. And they argued that instead of trying to form a united front with the Social Democrats, they should form what they called a united front from below and go to the working class and recruit the working class and not try to negotiate with the Social Democrats, not try to compromise with the Social Democrats, not try to have united efforts with the Social Democrats, but instead to build a united front from below to recruit the masses, the workers, and recruit the workers, recruit them and mobilize them in a communist movement. And Jim Garrison sends a super chat on Rockfin. He says, truth telling. Well, you're very welcome, Jim. Doing the best I can. And thank you. And they built the united front from below. And so immediately, starting in 1928, even before the Great Depression happened, the communist parties of the world began building unemployment councils and organizing the unemployed people into these associations that would fight for their rights. And they would get the unemployed people together, and they would march on City Hall and demand that the city spend some of its money on relief, providing food to hungry people. And these unemployment councils were completely controlled by the Communist Party. It was only the Communist Party that was running them. And, in his People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn gives the impression that was not the case, but it was the case. Everybody knew that the unemployment councils were a Communist Party-led operation, but people didn't care because they were starving. They were desperate. They were poor, and the Communist Party was the one group that cared enough about them and was organizing them to get any relief. And all throughout the country, in the urban centers and in the South and in many places, the Communist Party would come in and they would form the Unemployment Council. And every meeting they would talk about, in a Soviet America, there would be no unemployment, there would be no hunger. And it was a very red operation. And it was just, these people were desperate and poor, and somebody had to organize them. And so generally people had been taught anti-communism or whatever, but they were like, I'm hungry, I'm poor, I'm desperate, I'm starving, and these communists are forming an organization, so I'll join it. And millions of people became involved in the unemployed movement, it was called, and the Communist Party was the main organizer of the unemployed movement. Now, most people that were in the unemployment councils did not join the Communist Party because being a member of the Communist Party was like a full-time thing. I mean, it was not for everybody. Being a member of the Communist Party meant that you had to have a job where there were other communists. You could not have just any job. You had to work in a factory or what they called shop nuclei. You had to work at a job where there were at least 5 other communists. You had to, go to party meetings practically, every night. You had to sell their newspaper on your days off. It was being a member of the Communist Party during the 1930s was no joke. It was very, very, very demanding. And they only wanted people who would give what they called the whole of their lives. They did not want part-time members. They only wanted what they called professional revolutionaries. They were following Lenin and the Leninist teaching on the Vanguard Party. And they only wanted, quote unquote, professional revolutionaries to join their organization. And the unemployed councils were the center. They were the most dedicated people. The Communist Party were like the most dedicated people running the unemployment councils. But anyone who was unemployed could join the unemployment council. And the unemployment councils would, when someone would get evicted from their home, they would break the doors open and put their stuff back in. They would break into warehouses and feed people, that were hungry. Gus Hall tells the story. He was part of an unemployment council when he was a kid in the 1930s. And, the unemployment council, they all got together. They got crowbars and baseball bats, and they marched over to a food warehouse. They didn't know what was inside, and they pried the doors open, and it was full of candy. So, they got to have candy for dinner that night. All the unemployed families got to have candy for dinner because that was the food warehouse that they broke into. And Gus Hall apparently loved to tell that story. It was one of his fondest childhood memories, is when his parents that were in the Communist Party and all of them, they'd been hungry. They were poor in Minnesota. And they got together and they marched over to a food warehouse, and the unemployment council burst the locks of the food warehouse and burst it open. And instead of having regular food, it had candy. And so all the kids got to have candy for dinner that night. And they never forgot the night they had candy for dinner. That was the kind of thing that was going on. They also formed the Bonus Army, which was a group of thousands and thousands of veterans who were demanding that they get paid veterans benefits. They occupied Washington, D.C., and they were led by communists, and they were demanding the payment of veterans benefits. It was a mass upsurge. And the reason that the Communist Party focused on organizing the unemployed was because they were banned from the labor unions. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, banned Communist Party members from being in the labor unions. So the communists, they were not allowed to join the existing labor unions. So they started their own union federation, the Trade Union Unity League, but it was very small because it was communist led. And so they organized the unemployed. And it was a wild, you read about what the Communist Party accomplished during those years. It was amazing what they accomplished. And, they were just the group that fought for the desperately poor, the group that fought for the unemployed. And at the same time, probably the main reason they had so much energy was because the Soviet Union was booming, right? The capitalist world was having a Great Depression, right? The economy of the Western capitalist countries was falling apart, but the Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing and building itself up, building the world's largest power plants, the world's largest steel mills, building modern housing units. The people who lived in areas that had huts got modern housing units. The Soviet Union was electrifying the whole country. They were building new universities and new schools. And so while the capitalist West was completely falling apart and people were hungry and starving on the street, the Soviet Union was zooming ahead. And it was rapidly pulling itself up and raising millions of people out of poverty and becoming an industrial superpower. And so, at the same time that the communists obviously were saying we ought to have a Soviet America. And that was the slogan that the Communist Party used. They said, William Z. Foster, he wrote a book, Towards Soviet America, right? And that they wanted to build a Soviet America modeled on the Soviet Union. There were many capitalists like H.G. Wells, for example, who they were saying, how can we take some of what the Soviet Union is doing and apply it to Britain or the United States? And that was a big trend among capitalists as well. You had a lot of weird, social democrats, but also fascists who were trying to study what the Soviet Union had done, and trying to apply it without the socialist revolution part. And that was a really common trend. Mussolini, he wrote a book called Super Capitalism. And Mussolini argued that the Soviet Union was not really socialist, it was super capitalism. And he argued that Italian fascism was going to take the methods of the Soviet Union and apply them in Italy, and they were going to have a super capitalist system in Italy. That was how the Italian fascists talked. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, they were two very wealthy intellectuals who were in the British Labour Party. And they actually wrote this book. It's like a two-part book. It's actually very good. It's worth reading. It's called Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. And it's in two parts. You can order it. Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. These are two very, very prominent British politicians. Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. And they were not revolutionaries. They were reformist social democrats, and they did not believe in communism. But because the Soviet Union was doing so well economically, they went over to the Soviet Union and they wrote this book, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. It's a 2-volume set, and it's like a study of the Soviet system. Part 2. Like a 2-part study of the Soviet Union and its system and how they could learn from it. And that was a big trend too. Just going to fix my sound here. My microphone popped out. I'm trying to get the mic on. Here we go. All right. And it was like a 2-volume study of the Soviet system. And that was happening, right? And that there were all of these capitalists who were going over to the Soviet Union and studying what the Soviet Union was doing and trying to learn from it. One thing that Stalin did during that period was he had the big construction projects many people talk about. Stalin, he built the Dnieper Dam, which was the biggest hydroelectrical power plant in the world. He built it, right? He also built a subway system for Moscow, the Moscow subway system. And that Stalin, that's what Soviet media would talk about, right? If you went to the Soviet Union, the movie newsreels, they would show it be Stalin is going to lead the Soviet people in building this huge power plant. Stalin is going to lead the Soviet people in building this huge subway system. Stalin's going to lead the people in building this new university. And that was a lot of what the Soviet government, if you read the Communist Party newspapers, if you went to the Soviet Union, the focus was, we're going to build big, giant things. We're going to build big power plants. We're going to build big universities. We're going to, that was kind of the focus. So that is really what inspired Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration. Roosevelt, he very much was inspired by what Stalin was doing. And that the way Roosevelt, when he started the Works Progress Administration in 1935, and the Roosevelt administration began hiring the unemployed people, that was very much, they were trying to copy Soviet methods. And it was a similar thing. Roosevelt, when Roosevelt first came into office, he was kind of a right-wing Bonapartist. He came in and he was going to save capitalism. And he came into office. He said he had the New Deal and the National Recovery Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, he said. And he had this image of it, this logo of it. It was called the Blue Eagle. and all the kids in the school. It was a lot like Wilson. He'd been kind of appointed. He was an old school New England, old money guy, friends with the Rockefellers and others. He'd been selected by the ruling class, by the Eastern establishment, by the old money, tied in with the British, etc. They'd selected him to come in and be the Bonapartist strongman to save capitalism. And he came in and he had this blue eagle. And immediately, all the school kids, not only did they have to pledge allegiance to the American flag, they also had to pledge allegiance to the Blue Eagle. They had the Blue Eagle pledge, and they pledged to the Blue Eagle that was going to save the American economy. And Roosevelt killed half the cows in America. Funny story. But, you know, at the time, the price of beef was dropping very dramatically because people couldn't afford to buy it. And so they were desperate to sell beef. And so the price of beef was dropping and farmers were losing all their money. So Roosevelt, he sent the U.S. Department of Agriculture out and they killed half the cows in America. And they would go to every farm and they would confiscate half the cows and kill them and bury them. And they would pour lime on the dead bodies of the cows so that no one could dig them up and eat the meat. You know, and this resulted, by killing half the cows in America, that resulted in the price of beef doubling and going back up, and it kept the American agricultural business alive. It kept American farms going. And that Roosevelt was very much, he came into office as kind of a Bonapartist strongman. You know, that's what you're describing there, where you kill half the cows in the country. That's degrowth, right? That's what that is. That's degrowth. Right. And, you know, they were doing all kinds of things where they were destroying productive forces to try and stabilize capitalism. However, it wasn't working. It wasn't working. And there was a lot of instability in the country. Now, I told you about the unemployed rebellions that were happening, right? You had the communists were leading the unemployed. March 6th, 1931 was International Unemployment Day, where thousands of workers all over the United States and Western Europe protested against unemployment. And the unemployed rebellions were happening. The veterans in 1931, the summer of 1931, they occupied Washington, D.C., downtown, the National Mall. There was like a riot, and they fought the army, and like 5 people were killed. The tear gas was dispersed. It was a disaster. You know, there was just a rebellion in the country, right? After Roosevelt came in, the rebellion, the protests of the unemployed kept going. And then the labor unions got involved. And the summer of 1934, that was considered to be that is probably one of the most important years in American history. I mean, what happened in the summer of 1934? You want to talk about one of probably the most revolutionary moment in American history that we've had to date. Summer of 1934 in Minneapolis, the Teamsters, the Trotskyites took over the Teamsters Union, and the Teamsters, they said, make Minneapolis a union town, and they called a general strike. And they shut down Minneapolis. They set up loudspeakers in downtown Minneapolis, and they had guys with baseball bats all over the city and signs that said no scab trucks, and any truck that didn't have a pass from the union got its windows bashed in. And basically the Trotskyites seized control of Minneapolis, you know, and they were using the Teamsters Union, but it was run by the Trotskyites, by Bill Dunn, or not Bill Dunn, Earl Dunn, or the Dunn brothers, and Bill Brown, and James Cannon, and Farrell Dobbs, and they seized control of Minneapolis. And that was, you know, that was like you had a communist group, you know, a Trotskyite group seizing control of a major U.S. city. The National Guard was sent in. There was like a gunfight between the Trotskyites and the National Guard. That was in Minneapolis. San Francisco, the Communist Party USA took over the Dock Workers Union, and they shut down San Francisco. And usually when the dock workers would go on strike, they would hire the black people as scabs, as replacement labor, because the dock workers unions were racist. But when the Communist Party took over the dock workers union, it was anti-racist. And because it was an anti-racist union, The black people supported the strike. They included demands that black people be hired to work on the docks in their strike demands. And so the Communist Party was able to bring the black and white workers together. And you had the San Francisco General Strike of 1934, which again was very bloody. A lot of people died, armed confrontations between the Communist Party-led labor union and the National Guard and the military. The docks of San Francisco were very key for American capitalism. It's a very, very important port, and all the ships weren't being unloaded, and it brought the U.S. economy to a halt, basically. And ultimately, the dock workers were victorious, and the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, was created, which was a radical communist-led union. You also, that summer, you had in Toledo, Ohio, you had the Toledo Light Strike, which is there was a company called Auto Light. It was like an electrical company, like a power plant, an electric, company, the Auto Light, and the Auto Light workers went on strike, led by the American Workers' Party, which was led by A.J. Musty, but also by the Communist Party. The Communist Party and this other group called the American Workers' Party, which was kind of a social democratic group, they shut down Toledo, Ohio, and people were killed, and the National Guard was brought in. And in addition to that, in South Carolina, a state of emergency was declared because the Communist Party was leading the sharecroppers to go on strike and demand better treatment from the landowners, the landlords. And it was all over the country. You just had a massive rebellion by the working class, by the communist wing of the labor movement. The communists had built up so much support among the unemployed that they then could start building real support for their strikes. And that was the thing. The communists had built the unemployed councils. And these unemployed councils had so much support among unemployed people, but they had very few unions that they actually controlled. But when a communist union would go on strike, the unemployed councils that were led by the Communist Party would support the communist strike. And that's why the Communist Party, it was like they built up their forces first among the unemployed, and they built up enough strength that they could then really support, when the Teamsters of Minneapolis went on strike, the unemployed people poured into Minneapolis to support the Teamsters. When the dock workers of San Francisco went on strike, the unemployed councils, thousands of unemployed people, would pile into San Francisco to support the dockers, the dock workers, the longshoremen. And that this was a way, the Communist Party, they had organized the unemployed first. That gave them the ability to organize, to build support for the unions that they controlled. And the Communist Party did, just amazing things during this period. And it was, three major cities were being seized by communists. There was labor unrest happening all over the country. At that point, we understand that there was a plot to overthrow Roosevelt. There was a feeling that Roosevelt wasn't doing enough to stop the labor movement. The feeling was that Roosevelt, the factory owners, the National Association of Manufacturers wanted to bring in the military and crush the strikes. They wanted to have fascism, basically. They wanted to have an authoritarian state to just crush the labor movement because the people were rebelling. Roosevelt wasn't going to do that, so there was the business plot. There was an attempt to overthrow Roosevelt. The capitalists, the Wall Street billionaires were conspiring to overthrow Roosevelt. The infamous business plot was uncovered by Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps, and there were congressional hearings about the business plot, this conspiracy to overthrow Roosevelt. There was a fight within the ruling class, and the factory owners were fighting against the Eastern establishment, right? The Eastern establishment, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and others, they were with Roosevelt. They were folks that were tied in with Wall Street, making money from oil. However, there were other folks, in the ruling class, like Henry Ford, like Henry Morgan, who were factory owners, and they wanted to crush Roosevelt, and they were sympathetic with fascism. So there was a fight in the ruling class. Now, what resulted was Roosevelt, facing the threat of a fascist coup and being overthrown, was forced to enter a strategic alliance with the Soviet Union and with the Communist Party. He recognized the Soviet Union. He began hiring the unemployed to his Works Progress administration. And then on top of that, Roosevelt, he then he then took the dramatic move of he supported the sit-down strike wave of 1937 when workers were occupying their factories. He said workers had the right to occupy their factories, and he supported the sit-down strike wave, and he was aligned with the sit-down strikers. And you had just an upsurge of labor activism led by the Communist Party. Eventually, the CIO was formed. It was a breakaway from the AFL, and the CIO was led by communists. The AFL banned communists, but the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, allowed communists to join, and communists were the main organizers of the CIO. And you had basically, in his final years, Roosevelt, as the late 30s set in the lead into World War II, you had a popular front government in the United States. It wasn't a socialist government by any means. It was a lot like AMLO, right? Roosevelt was a lot like AMLO in Mexico. AMLO is not a communist, not a socialist, but because he's fighting with other factions of the ruling class, he is in a strategic alliance with communists, with Russia, with China, with Venezuela, with Iran. And because he's under attack, he has to be very friendly to those forces, but he ultimately doesn't represent them. AMLO is a Bonapartist, but he's a Bonapartist who's entered an alliance with the communists and is increasingly more dependent on the communists, right? That's like Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not a communist, but he was under threat. He was a Bonapartist, and he was under threat from other factions in the ruling class. So he increasingly became reliant on the communists. And in his second term, the second term of his administration, from when he got reelected in 1936 up until 1940, Roosevelt was very dependent on the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, he was inviting them to the White House. He was sending Eleanor Roosevelt to speak at their events. I mean, he was, at that point, the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, right, which the Communist Party represented. They were the U.S. wing of the global communist movement. The Communist Party representing the Soviet Union was a big part of the Roosevelt coalition. And Roosevelt, it was kind of like a popular front government. Now, things got complicated. 1939, you had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. And so Roosevelt retaliated and put Earl Browder, the head of the Communist Party, in prison. But then when World War II broke out, they let Earl Browder out of prison, and the Communist Party became big, enthusiastic supporters of World War II. And, Roosevelt was hiring communist writers to write, war propaganda films. And when World War II broke out, the Communist Party was very much a part of the American government, right? I mean, and they were not trusted. The FBI was still monitoring them and considered them to be dirty, rotten Reds. And, there was this layer within the capitalist class that had tried to overthrow Roosevelt. They'd formed the America First Committee, it was called, that was sympathetic with the Nazis. And there was a layer within the American government that was pro-Hitler. But then once Pearl Harbor was attacked, they went behind Roosevelt. They lined up with Roosevelt. But there was a division in the ruling class. And because of that, the Communist Party was part of the Roosevelt coalition. And we had more or less a popular front government in the United States, a government where the communists were part of it. They were allowed to exist. They were considered essential allies of the ruling faction of the ruling class. And that's what you had, right? For example, the vice president was Henry Wallace, and Henry Wallace had been in the Socialist Party. Henry Wallace, said glowing things about Stalin. He gave a speech called The Century for the Common Man during World War II, where he was praising the Soviet Union for everything it had achieved. And you had that. You also had many other things that were happening during that time. Lillian Hellman was writing Hollywood movies portraying Ukrainian villagers fighting off the Nazis, like the North Star. Earl Browder was being invited to the State Department frequently, the head of the Communist Party, to, consult about how to make the war effort work. And the world was having an ugly war. I mean, World War II was happening, and people were dying, and the Communist Party was an essential part of the Roosevelt coalition. Now, to be fair, I have to point out that the Communist Party overdid it during World War II. Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party, way overdid it during World War II. It was right to support the U.S. government against the Nazis. It was right to support the U.S. government in the Second World War, right? And if the USA had been a socialist country, it would have done the same thing. It would have aided the USSR against the Nazis. A a lot of Trotskyites, even some Maoists, have this idea that like World War II was bad. You know, it was an unjust war. You would never support the American imperialists in World War II. No. Yes, the USA was imperialist. And yes, the way the USA fought World War II was unprincipled. They didn't open up a second front. They made the Soviet Union do a lot of its fighting on its own. You know, they were the whole time, you know, preparing to attack the Soviet Union afterwards. But it was still right to support the American government in World War II because they were aligned with the Soviet Union. They were fighting against the Nazis. They were, you know, liberating concentration camps. The USA was on the right side of World War II. No question about it. However, the Communist Party USA, they went over the top. One thing that they did, you know, was they fully cooperated and supported Japanese internment. They shouldn't have done that. They should have opposed Japanese internment. You know, rounding up all the Japanese people on the basis of just being Japanese and putting them in prison camps was something that happened during World War II that was very wrong. It was a horrendous policy. And the Communist Party basically sent a letter to all of its Japanese members telling them to comply and basically telling them they were not members of the party anymore. That was wrong. It was unbelievably wrong. The Communist Party also dissolved during World War II and became the Communist Political Association, which was very stupid and wrong. And Earl Browder, he then wrote this book during, you know, right afterwards. This book Earl Browder wrote during World War II. It's called Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace. And basically this book, you know, they don't believe in communism anymore. Now, the Communist Political Association, it basically says that the Soviet Union and the USA should merge into one country that will combine the best elements of both capitalism and socialism. It says there will be no more need for strikes because the employers who believe in democracy and the workers who are anti-fascist will have unity. And that Earl Browder, he took the support for Roosevelt during World War II and the support for the American government in World War II to ridiculous conclusions. And that's what Browderism is. Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party, basically saw the alliance between the United States government and the Soviet Union and the alliance between the Roosevelt administration and the Communist Party as an excuse to throw in the towel and stop being a communist. You know, and that wasn't right. You know, so we can condemn that. We can say that, you know, the way they conducted themselves during World War II was not correct. There's nothing wrong with saying that. You know, but that doesn't mean, by the way, that it was wrong to support World War II. It also doesn't mean that all socialist patriotism or waving the flag was wrong. And honestly, if you look at the rhetoric of Roosevelt and Henry Wallace during that war, the U.S. government was putting out a very progressive message. They were condemning British imperialism and colonialism. They were praising the Soviet Union and praising Stalin. And, you know, because the Communist Party was so essential and because the Soviet Union was such a big part of the anti-fascist coalition, because Mao was an ally of the United States and China fighting against Japan, the U.S. government, you know, was sounding pretty good. I mean, it was sounding pretty good during those years. I mean, it's hard. There's no way to get around that. The Roosevelt administration, it wasn't a socialist administration, but it was a popular front government. And it was pretty good. And, you know, they created Social Security. They created unemployment insurance. They created the U.S. Department of Agriculture and food stamps. And they did a lot of things to try and stabilize capitalism and give working people more opportunities. And so, you know, we can talk about the Roosevelt administration being very good despite its flaws. Now, they didn't fight Jim Crow, obviously. You know, the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, you know, they were still racist as hell and practicing Jim Crow segregation. That was awful. Roosevelt, you know, was not perfect. Now, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, she started opposing Jim Crow and denouncing Jim Crow segregation. You know, and Roosevelt would say, well, he didn't agree with her. And he would say, well, that's not his business. You know, the Communist Party, their ally in Congress was a guy named Vito Marcantonio, an Italian-American from Harlem who was elected to the U.S. Congress. And he was not in the Communist Party, but he was a good friend of the Communist Party. He was part of the American Labor Party, which is like a coalition he'd formed. He would put forward the anti-lynching bill, the famous anti-lynching bill, and it would get voted down every time. The Democrats would always vote against it. The Communist Party was organizing for the Scottsboro nine African-American youth who were falsely accused of rape and thrown in prison. And the Communist Party was talking about racism, but, the Roosevelt administration wasn't. So, it's not that we can't criticize the Roosevelt administration, but they were aligned with communists. They were passing progressive reforms. They were doing good things. However, World War II came to an end. And it was very clear that coming out of World War II, the United States, the main feeling among the ruling class that was universal, the Rockefellers, the Eastern establishment, as well as the lower level capitalists, the National Association of Manufacturers, Henry Ford, all of them, they wanted to crush the Soviet Union. They were terrified of all the gains the Soviet Union was making during World War II. The Soviet Union had liberated Eastern Europe. The Communist Party of China had grown by leaps and bounds. The communists in Italy were huge. The communists in France had been leaders of the anti-fascist resistance. They were huge. Communists came out of World War II looking pretty damn good because the communists had been opposing fascism all this time. They had been building united fronts against fascism and protesting against fascism. The Soviet Union had been raising the alarm about the evils of fascism. And then when World War II happened, the communists in all the countries that were occupied by fascists, they were the best anti-fascist fighters, the leaders of the partisan brigades in Italy, the leaders of the resistance in France, the leaders of, in the Philippines, they were fighting the Japanese. They had these armed groups that fought against the Japanese, occupiers. And, on the Korean Peninsula, they'd been leading the guerrilla fights against the Japanese occupiers. Kim Il-sung was like a legendary hero. Kim becomes the sun. He was this legendary outlaw who was, leading bands of, heroic fighters to fight the Japanese in the Korean mountains. And everywhere, communists came out of World War II looking really damn good. Communists came out of World War II looking like these guys were right all along, especially when the Holocaust, came out, when people saw what the Holocaust was. It was like, wow, these communists were right all along about Hitler. They were right all along about Mussolini. The communists came out of World War II looking really damn good, really damn good. And membership in communist groups around the world was expanding. Eastern Europe was moving towards socialism. China was moving very quickly towards socialism. The Korean Peninsula, North Korea, you had the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. All over the world, people were joining communist organizations. So the U.S. ruling class was very terrified of it. Now, Roosevelt was such a Bonapartist and such a strong man and had become such an ally of the Soviet Union and such an ally of the U.S. Communist Party and the labor movement. We don't know what he would have done, but he died. He died at a very, very convenient time. Now, I have no evidence of him being, assassinated or anything like that. I know there are various theories about that. I will say it's really suspicious that Roosevelt died at the time that he died. It's very, very suspicious that he died at that time because it was right at the right time. Roosevelt died right as the United States was moving away from an alliance with the Soviet Union and starting the Cold War. And Roosevelt died. And coming out of World War II, suddenly the USA had a booming economy again. And the USA had a booming economy. Now to be fair, the factory owners didn't, they were still paying workers what they paid them at the beginning of the war. There was a wage freeze at the beginning of World War II. And the factory owners didn't want to raise the wages. So right after World War II, there was a strike wave all across the country. The 1946 strike wave. The auto workers went on strike. The steel workers went on strike. And the capitalists just gave in. And then suddenly the wages of factory workers in the United States shot up because they could afford to pay it, because the rest of the world had been blown up in a war. And the Second World War had destroyed all the other countries. And also Roosevelt had built the infrastructure. He had built all kinds of roads throughout the United States. He'd built all kinds of highways and bridges and power plants throughout the United States. So the USA, because he, electrified the country, Roosevelt had electrified rural regions, brought electricity to rural areas. Roosevelt had done so much to kind of set the stage that after World War II, you had the strike wave of 1946, where, the wages of industrial workers shot up, and the USA suddenly had a booming economy. And that was how they got over that crisis. That was the second capitalist crisis. I told you how they got to the 1920s. Well, that's how they got to the 1950s. They had World War II. And then, of course, in the 1950s, just like in the 1920s, they crushed the Communist Party USA with McCarthyism. They said that America will always be booming and blossoming, and American prosperity will go on forever. The McCarthyist witch hunts happened. There was a huge suppression of the Communist Party. The USA had a booming economy. They resolved that crisis. They resolved the crisis. So that's how they got the 1950s. That's how they got out of the revolutionary crisis, or the crisis of capitalism, created in the late 20s, early 30s, right? So that's how they got there. So the point of my live stream tonight, just to remind those of you who may not have been there at the beginning, is I'm trying to say, how do they resolve this one? How do they get the 20s again? I told you how they got out of the crisis in the lead up to World War I, and how they got the 1920s, the roaring 20s, capitalism stabilized. Now, I just finished telling you how they got out of the crisis of the 1930s. So now, how did they get the 80s again? How did they get the 1980s? And what's interesting, it should be the 80s and 90s, really. What's interesting about this one is that there wasn't a deep economic crisis so much. This one's a little bit different, right? In the lead up to World War I, you had economic crisis, you had Bonapartism and fighting within the ruling class, and then you had a big, huge war, and it was stable. Same thing happened in the 30s. Economic crisis, Bonapartism, fighting in the ruling class, big, huge war, and stability. What happened in the United States from like the early 60s up until 1979 was a little bit different. And so I'm going to talk about that situation. And that one's a little bit different. And we'll talk about it. But you had a political crisis in the United States in the 1960s while there was still a booming economy. And that's what made the political crisis of the 1960s very different from the 30s, from the early 20th century. There was a booming economy during those years. A booming economy. In the 1960s, I mean, I don't know if you've ever talked to any old folks who were around then, but they talk about how, you could not have a high school diploma. You could get a job in a factory and make enough that, just to have the wife not work and raise 3 kids and have an automobile. People would get fired, people would get fired one day from their job, and they'd walk across the street and they'd start another job at a construction site across the street that same day. That the USA, it was still the post-World War II economic expansion. The post-World War II economic expansion is the largest episode of economic growth in human history. And it was global. The socialist countries were booming at that point, industrializing rapidly. The United States was booming with the 1950s. Europe was booming, and you had social democracy in Europe. You had a lot of third world countries were industrializing with, Bonapartist authoritarian military governments, and that the post-World War II economic expansion was a prolonged episode of economic growth. And it was because during the Great Depression, all kinds of mechanisms for stabilizing capitalism had been invented, right? They had invented all kinds of things. For example, the FDIC, so that if you go to the bank, they make sure you get your money, right? If a bank collapses, you still get your money because of this thing called the FDIC. They had food stamps. They had unemployment insurance. They had, all kinds of government jobs, all over Europe. The government employed people to do all kinds of crap. If you lost your job, the government would hire you to paint pictures, and you'd be paid as a government painter, right? In France, at one point in the 60s, they had 100% employment because anyone who lost their job immediately got hired by the government to paint pictures and become a painter. There was all kinds of welfare state mechanisms to try and stabilize capitalism. They talk about the Keynesian consensus, right? During the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes, he had been the primary economist of Britain. And he said, basically, you have to have the government spend lots of money to deal with the problem of underconsumption. He didn't call it overproduction. He insisted Marx's idea of overproduction was no. He didn't believe in that. But the problem was underconsumption. And so underconsumption was the problem, and that, that the governments had to spend money, and they called it the Keynesian consensus because governments, they didn't want a crisis like the 1930s to happen again, right? The 1930s, you'd had a huge mass communist movement. You'd also had fascism arise and crush the communist movements. Then you'd had World War II. And World War II was a horrendous, traumatizing experience where millions and millions and millions and millions of people died. And there was a feeling among everybody, including the ruling class, they wanted to do everything they could to make sure something like World War II never happened again. And that was the Keynesian consensus. And they invented all kinds of mechanisms for stabilizing capitalism. The idea was we have to have the government spend money on all kinds of shit to make sure we never have this happen again. In the United States, the main form of Keynesianism was the military-industrial complex. And that was the government in the United States spending billions and billions of dollars on bombs and tanks and weapons. And that's the main way we do it. I don't know what it is. In the United States, I guess we have this pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We weren't as much into the welfare state stuff as the European people were. We had some welfare stuff. I mean, college was very cheap back in those days. I mean, it was more of a welfare state than we have now, but at the same time, in America, we just have this, I don't know what it is, this radical liberal mindset of individualism. We don't want to help people. So in the United States, we had the military-industrial complex is the main mechanism for stabilizing capitalism. Just pour lots of government money into building bombs and tanks and weapons. That was the main way capitalism was stabilized in the United States. But you had all kinds of methods to stabilize capitalism. You had the post-World War II economic expansion. However, you still had problems, right? Race is probably one of the, I believe it's considered to be America's deep, dark secret. Lenin said that race was probably what would destroy American capitalism, interestingly. Lenin, in his writing, he said it will be the black question that will destroy America. And I think Stalin made similar statements. The Jim Crow segregation in the South, the treatment of black people, the legacy of slavery, that was still hanging over the United States. And you had the South where black people did not have any rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't drink out of the same drinking fountains. They were, living in segregated conditions, apartheid. And then in the North, you had impoverished urban centers where black people lived, and they were the first fired and the last hired. They got poverty wages. They were living in horrendous conditions. And during the Second World War, in the lead up to the Second World War, you had a rise of black nationalism in the United States. It was mainly in the urban centers. You'd had you'd had the Nation of Islam formed. Elijah Muhammad, who was from Detroit, he formed the Nation of Islam, and it was this black nationalist movement. Eventually, Malcolm X was recruited, and the Nation of Islam urged black people not to fight in World War II. It urged black people to support Japan because Japan were not white, and to support Japan in World War II, and that there was also some odd sympathy for the Axis among different black nationalist groups. You'd had another black nationalist group. It wasn't really a black nationalist group, but it was a pro-black, civil rights group in New York City and in Philadelphia that was led by Father Divine. Father Divine was this black minister who claimed he was a messiah, and he was leading a mass movement to liberate black people, to free black people from racism. And you had this mass, this mass feeling of unrest among American black people that was there. And the Communist Party had heavily recruited among black people during the 1930s and even the 1950s. They had a lot of black members. Coming out of World War II, they formed the Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization that supported black people who were arrested in the Jim Crow South when black people were facing the death penalty. They would support black people. They provided lawyers. I guess one of the lawyers that they hired, one of the women who was a lawyer for the Civil Rights Congress was what was her name? She was a congresswoman in New York City for many years, and she had started out with the Communist Party and the Civil Rights Congress. What was her name? I can't remember her name. Bella Abzug. Bella Abzug was her name. And she was a Jewish woman in New York City who was friendly with the Communist Party. And she became a lawyer. And she was known, she would go to the South and defend black people who were accused, who were on trial. You know, Bella Abzug. And she eventually became a member of the U.S. Congress during the 1980s. You know, in the 70s, I think. She became more of a liberal over the years. She stopped being sympathetic to communism. She was a big Zionist, a huge supporter of Israel. But you had Bella Abzug, and you had people like that were considered to be left-wing. And, you know, it was the Communist Party had talked about race. Well, you know, as the 1950s rolled around, you know, in the United States, things were pretty solidly locked down. The Communist Party was stamped out and, you know, kept quiet by McCarthyism and FBI repression. However, around the world, especially in Africa, there was a wave of anti-colonial national liberation movements. Patrice Lumumba, you know, was leading the people of the Congo. You had Kwame Nkrumah, who was leading the people of Ghana. You had all kinds of anti-colonial movements in South Africa. You had, you know, the South African Communist Party, you know, was engaged in like revolutionary armed struggle against apartheid. There was a wave of anti-colonial movements, and communists were the leaders of those anti-colonial movements. And there was a feeling in the United States, and this is really interesting. There was a feeling among the ruling class that Jim Crow segregation was helping the communists, because communists around the world were pointing to how black people were treated in the United States and saying that America were hypocrites. African people who were being courted by the United States as allies against the Soviet Union were looking at the treatment of Jim Crow and how black people were treated and saying, you know, you're not really our friend if you do this to black people in America. There's the famous photo of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young black man from Chicago, a teenager. He went down to visit his relatives in Mississippi. He was accused of whistling at a white woman. He was brutally murdered, tortured to death. The photograph of his mutilated body was sent all over the world to show the world what the United States does to black people. The Soviet Union sent that photograph everywhere. And the Communist Party, despite being crushed by the FBI, they still had a lot of support among the black community because they were anti-racist. And they, you know, Paul Robeson, a very famous Broadway musician and athlete, Paul Robeson, you know, was a Communist Party member and was sympathetic to the Communist Party. Many black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois were considered allies of the Communist Party. And there was a feeling among the American elite that they needed to deal with the race question. And the Kennedy family, in particular, they ran, you know, the Boston Democratic Party. The Kennedy family decided to start opposing Jim Crow and start kind of supporting the civil rights movement. Not completely, but the Kennedy family started kind of supporting the civil rights movement. Kind of, not really, but kind of. The United Auto Workers Union, which was led by Victor and Walter Reuther, and they were two social democrat union guys. They got permission from the Democratic Party and others to sponsor the Montgomery bus boycott. You know, the famous, and that's where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came from. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, and he was young enough to be a black activist who was not associated with communism. He was only in his early 30s, I believe, and so he was young enough that he had no relationship to the Communist Party. All the older black leaders, you know, were associated or had been friendly with the Communist Party at one point. And the reason they picked Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was he was young enough that he didn't have an association with the Communist Party. So he was young enough, and they made him the front man, you know, the face of the Montgomery bus boycott. And he was a very good speaker and very articulate. And, you know, they made him the front man for the Montgomery bus boycott. And he became kind of a national celebrity. And after that, he began, you know, protesting in different parts of the country or in different parts of the South around different issues. And they were opposing Jim Crow segregation. And of course, that was a really, really big deal. You know, I mean, Jim Crow segregation was something that many Southern people were, you know, Southern white racists were very, very committed to. And it was a big shakeup. And the civil rights movement was getting support from the northern wing of the Democratic Party. And McCarthyism had kind of given birth to this kind of right-wing populism that the ruling class was very nervous about. You know, when the U.S. Army was being accused of being communists, when the Rockefellers and the Morgans are being accused of being communists, you know, the way, you know, that certain, you know, when you have members of Congress who commit suicide, there was a member of Congress who committed suicide because Joe McCarthy found out that his son was gay and was going to use that against him. And so he committed suicide, and that the McCarthyism was hurting the interests of American imperialism. The American imperialists wanted to use Yugoslavia as an ally against the Soviet Union, but McCarthyists said, no, we'll never support any communists. You know, the Rockefellers and others had a strategy. They wanted to manipulate China against the Soviet Union, but they couldn't do it because McCarthyists said, we'll never be friendly with any communists, right? And that there was a feeling among the ruling class that this anti-communist hysteria that they'd created during the boom of the 1950s was damaging the interests of American imperialism. And so they wanted to move away from it. And so there was a fight in the ruling class. John F. Kennedy was elected president. John F. Kennedy considered himself to be a supporter of the civil rights movement. Kind of, not really. We know what happened to Kennedy. He was assassinated. And, you know, after that, many of the younger people who'd been involved in protesting and supporting the civil rights movement got involved in protesting against the Vietnam War. And there was a division in the ruling class. The Eastern establishment basically didn't want a military escalation in Vietnam. The military-industrial complex did. You know, and there's, you know, I recommend, if you want to learn about the divisions in the ruling class that kind of defined the 1960s political upsurge, I would recommend reading The Yankee and Cowboy War, Conspiracies from Dallas to Watergate. This talks about the divisions in the ruling class. You know, okay. Where does the claim that MLK is a communist come from? All right. You know, there were divisions in the ruling class, and, you know, one wing of the ruling class basically wanted to use proxies and wanted to make the United States look really friendly. And another wing of the ruling class wanted to use all-out military force and destruction. And there was a push and pull and a battle between them. And, you know, there was also a cultural division. One section of the ruling class said that the way to fight communism was by creating an authoritarian state, the McCarthyist kind of stuff, the military-industrial wing. The military-industrial complex, they wanted to build kind of a very authoritarian military state to stabilize capitalism. They were all about social conservatism. They were all about right-wing, you know, right-wing patriotism, etc. The Rockefellers, the Rockefeller family, they had funded, you know, the birth control movement. They had funded the research of who was the sexologist, the big sexologist out of Indiana. What was his name? I can't remember his name. The big sex guy. You know, he wrote the Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey. They'd funded the Kinsey report, the work of Alfred Kinsey, and the Rockefeller family. They were arguing that the way to defeat communism was by creating a wave of social liberalism. You know, and you know, if you read this book, I recommend Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski was largely a Rockefeller creation, and they were arguing that basically the way the world was changing, right? The world was changing. Hold on, I got to fix my bookshelf. They were arguing that the world was changing because of the information revolution, that the way people related to authority, the way people trusted each other, social hierarchies were being loosened because of the information revolution. And there was a feeling on the part of the Rockefellers and Brzezinski and the liberal Eastern establishment that they could use the sexual revolution, they could use drugs, they could use popular culture to create instability and unrest to defeat communism. And there was a feeling among the McCarthyists and the hard military right wing that it was the opposite. It was like, to defeat communism, we needed to be very rigid and controlled, etc. Right? Okay. All right. Taft-Hartley Law and Powell Memo. All right. Wrote it down. And that was their feeling, right? And that there was a fight, and that Nixon was very much with the military-industrial complex. And, obviously, Kennedy had been with that Eastern establishment, and there had been this fight within the ruling class. And that had culminated in huge anti-war protests against the Vietnam War, that had culminated in the Black Liberation Movement and the rise of we got another one. Jim Garrison says, shouted, "Who killed the Kennedys?" when after all, it was you and me. That's a quote from a Rolling Stones song. But thank you, Jim, for the super chat on Rockfin. Let's not forget there's people watching on Rockfin right now. There was a division in the ruling class that had played out. Now, that division in the ruling class had pretty much been resolved by Nixon taking office. Nixon was a right-wing strongman, and he came in, and when he first came into office, Nixon's economic advisor was Milton Friedman, the libertarian economist. Milton Friedman, who wrote Free to Choose, and, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who's a crazy libertarian, neoliberal, free market guy. Milton Friedman had been Nixon's economic advisor, but then the economy had crashed. And you had an economic downturn in like 1971, I believe, 1971 or 2. So when that happened, Nixon kicked Milton Friedman out of the White House, and he said, we're all Keynesians now. He took the USA off the gold standard. He imposed a wage freeze and a price freeze. And he took a number of dramatic moves to try and stabilize capitalism. He also escalated the Vietnam War with massive bombing. And then when it became clear that that wasn't going to work, he withdrew the United States from Vietnam. He lowered the voting age to 18. He created the Office of Workplace Health and Safety, OSHA. He created the Environmental Protection Agency. Nixon enacted a lot of very dramatic reforms that a lot of leftists would agree with. He created affirmative action policies, for example. He did a lot of stuff to try and stabilize capitalism. And Nixon, by the time Nixon had left office, when he was forced to resign in 1974, the crisis, the political upsurge of the 1960s was over. Nixon, part of the reason he was removed was that he was afraid to mess with the economy. And that's the interesting thing. He had kicked Milton Friedman out of the White House. And as much as he was a right-wing conservative, authoritarian, he told the FBI to take the gloves off and crush the Black Panther Party with COINTELPRO. He was awful, right? And Ramsey Clark, who I used to work for, had been fired by Nixon. Nixon had said the first thing he would do when he takes office was fire Ramsey Clark, and Ramsey Clark was fired. And Ramsey Clark had been holding back the FBI and refusing wiretaps on civil rights leaders like Stokely Carmichael, etc. And when Ramsey Clark was out of there, and then they brought in the head of the DOJ, was somebody that Nixon had appointed, all bets were off. And J. Edgar Hoover just viciously went after the Black Panthers. Fred Hampton was murdered. Drugs were planted on people. They just viciously went after the Black Panthers and crushed them and other Black liberation groups. But while Nixon was this authoritarian right-wing guy, he advocated a guaranteed minimum income for all families with children. He wanted the government to provide a guaranteed minimum income to all families with children. He wanted to increase the birth rate of the country, which is very interesting, right? The Rockefeller Eastern Establishment folks, they didn't want to increase the birth rate. They wanted to reduce the population. They're obsessed with overpopulation. Nixon, on the other hand, was saying we don't have enough people in America. We need more consumers to buy our products. We need more workers to have a productive economy. He wanted to give a cash incentive to American families to have children. He wanted to basically say that any family that has more than 2 children gets an automatic payment of what would be today about $20,000. Can you imagine that? Basically, if the government of the United States said, hey, if you have 2 kids, we give you $20,000 every year. And that's unheard of nowadays. But, you know, they were trying to incentivize increasing the population. And Nixon represented, to some degree or other, the military-industrial complex in the lower levels of capital. When he was forced to resign, Gerald Ford became president of the United States. And Gerald Ford brought into office, he brought in Donald Rumsfeld, who was a big figure in the Bush administration. He brought in Dick Cheney, who was the vice president for Bush. And he also brought in Ayn Rand and Alan Greenspan. He made Alan Greenspan an official U.S. government economist. And Alan Greenspan brought Ayn Rand to the White House for his swearing-in ceremony. You can look at, there's a picture of Alan Greenspan taking the oath for his first government job. Standing next to him is Ayn Rand, the author of Atlas Shrugged. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Unbelievable to watch, that Ayn Rand is there. And that really Nixon's ouster. Nixon was a right-wing Bonapartist to some degree or other. And when he was ousted, he was replaced with, that was the rise of neoliberal economics. Right? Even though Nixon was awful in many, many ways, and he was happy to unleash neoliberal economics on Chile, he was not himself an adherent of neoliberal economics. And he was not going to allow neoliberal economics in the United States because he wanted power, right? And as a politician, he knew that neoliberal economics leads to impoverishing countries. But when Nixon was ousted, they brought in neoliberal economics. And things in the United States started to get worse. Jimmy Carter came into office, and Jimmy Carter was the new left. The new left. He was the candidate of the hippies, basically. You'd had the political upsurge of the 60s. You had all the anger about JFK being killed. You had LBJ, who was just hated. He was considered to be, the hippies had chanted, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? LBJ was considered a right-wing militarist Democrat. LBJ was out of office. Nixon had been the president. And then Gerald Ford had replaced Nixon when Nixon stepped down. And so then Jimmy Carter came into office as the first president of the new left. This was not the old Democratic Party. This was the Democratic Party that had been reinvented by the new left, by the 60s counterculture, by Project MK Ultra and the LSD, drug culture, by environmentalism and Malthusianism, the idea that there are too many people in the world, that Jimmy Carter was the new left coming to the White House. And Zbigniew Brzezinski became his national security advisor. And the Carter administration was very much, that was the Eastern establishment, the Rockefellers. They were imposing their degrowth agenda on the United States. And they had a commission beforehand. I mean, that they had Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger had been commissioned by the Rockefeller family. They'd been given lots of money to set up a think tank called the Trilateral Commission. And the Trilateral Commission was this think tank that basically reinvented U.S. foreign policy, reinvented U.S. domestic policy, and they published all kinds of papers about how they were going to reinvent the United States to be a post-industrial society, right, without factories, without industry, to reduce the birth rate in the population, to decrease democratic involvement and participation by the population. That was what they were doing. And almost everyone from the Carter administration, every person appointed to the Carter administration was from the Trilateral Commission. And it was just all Rockefeller people that were brought in. And then about 2 years into the Carter presidency, the U.S. economy had a very serious downturn, a very serious dramatic downturn. 1972 downturn had been nothing compared to this. It was the first major economic downturn the United States had since the end of the Second World War. 78, 79, you had a very dramatic economic downturn. You had, the OPEC boycott, and there was a shortage of gasoline in the country. You had the Islamic Revolution of Iran. And you started to have big divisions in U.S. society, big divisions among the U.S. ruling elite. That was very, very clear. And in this book, this new book that I wrote, one of the appendices I included in here, appendices, the first appendix that is in this book is a timeline of 1978 through 1981. And I included this timeline because it's very clear, 1978 to 1981, the ruling class of the United States, amid this economic downturn, were fighting with each other. There was a war going on within the U.S. ruling class, but it was a shadow war. There were all these counter gangs that had been formed, all these fanatical groups and organizations that were being used by one wing of the ruling class against another. And they were all being used, and there was this war going on, like a shadow war going on within the American government. Jimmy Carter and the Eastern establishment and the Rockefellers were fighting against the military-industrial complex. The Nixon people that eventually picked Ronald Reagan as their guy, the military-industrial complex and the Eastern establishment were having a very intense shadow war. And I don't have time here. I mean, we're almost at the 2-hour mark. I don't have time to go into all the things here. But if you have a copy of the book, go and read the timeline of events. It is crazy. David Duke, that's when David Duke became the big Ku Klux Klan guy. This was the period when all the communist parties were very, very active. The Workers' World Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Revolutionary Communist Party. This is the period where the LaRouche people were very active. This is the period when Reverend Sun Myung Moon from Korea was very, very active. There was a shadow war going on. The American deep state was at war with itself. And it was crazy. One thing that happened was Park Chung-hee, the military dictator of South Korea, was assassinated. And prior to his assassination, the Carter administration had basically had all these hearings going on about what they called Koreagate. Koreagate, and it was going on. It happened, and that was taking place, and there was all this talk about South Korea and their influence in the American government, and that South Korea had tried to get its own nuclear weapons. There was all kinds of stuff going on behind the scenes. Another thing that happened during this period was it was revealed that a huge number of elected government officials in Italy were part of a CIA group called the P2 Lodge. There was a Freemason Masonic lodge in Italy that, a number of Italian elected officials that were conservative or right-wing were involved with, and it was run by the CIA. And that all these elected officials in Italy had been involved in a secret society that was run by the CIA that had been involved in killing communists and carrying out political assassinations. And so, thousands of Italian politicians had to resign because it was revealed that they'd been involved in the P2 Lodge. I mean, I will link you. It's one of the wildest things, right? It sounds like something from QAnon or a conspiracy theory, but P2 Lodge, look it up. I'll link you in the chat. Propaganda Do or P2 Masonic Lodge, and it was revealed that that the CIA had formed this secret society. And half the Italian government were members of it, right? And that was leaked because there was a fight within the ruling class. And so, the P2 Lodge was revealed, and all kinds of crazy things were happening. And I go into great detail. And it was escalating to the point that there was an uprising going on among the American ruling class, among the military-linked wings of the American ruling class. They were rising up against, very, very, very much against, and very much against the Eastern establishment. And, and that Jimmy Carter, his administration, they published the Global 2000 report, which was an official White House document saying it was the job and the job of the United States to drive down the population of the world, to reduce the population. The Carter administration, they got rid of all the regulation of lending. A lot of states had laws regulating the lending of money. Jimmy Carter, brought in, financial advisors, and they passed laws that basically deregulated lending. And they took a lot of dramatic moves to try and impose this kind of degrowth agenda. And the military industrial complex that, is all about growth and making lots of money through bombs and tanks and weapons. They picked Ronald Reagan to be their guy to lead the revolt against Jimmy Carter. And the Iran hostage crisis happened, and there were all these rallies against Iran, and they accused Jimmy Carter of being soft on Iran. And, it was a big fight within the ruling class, and it was spawned by an economic downturn, a capitalist crisis, and the rise of socialism around the world was leading to that. But what happened? Well, Ronald Reagan picked George Bush as his running mate, which was a compromise with the Eastern establishment, because George Bush was a Connecticut old money Yale billionaire. I mean, he was a wealthy guy. And, the U.S. economy started to stabilize. The economic downturn started to stabilize. And by the early 80s, Ronald Reagan said, we're all friends after 6. The U.S. economy was stabilizing. And then you had the fall of the Eastern Bloc at the end of the 80s. And pretty soon in the 90s, the U.S. economy was stable again. The ruling class weren't fighting with each other anymore, and things were stable. And so they got the 80s. And that's how that crisis. Now, that was not primarily an economic crisis. It was a result of a political crisis among our U.S. ruling class, spawned by the black question and the rise of communism around the world and the cultural changes of the information revolution. But then really the culmination of the fight within the ruling class, I would argue, came in the late 70s, and the transition from Carter to Reagan. That was an all-out political war between the Eastern establishment and its counter gangs and the military-industrial complex and their counter gangs. And it kind of resolved itself. By 1981, 1982, it was over. Now, that brings us to today, because I started this stream by saying, how does the ruling class get stability again? How do they get the 20s, right? Out of the crisis of World War I and the Wobblies and the Bonapartism of Wilson and all of that, they got the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. Out of the crisis of the Great Depression and World War II and Roosevelt and the Popular Front, they got the 1950s. Out of the crisis of 1979, 1980, they ultimately, in the crisis of the 60s, really, they got the 80s. How does the ruling class get stability again? And I keep running the scenarios in my head and asking that question. How do they resolve the crisis again? How do they resolve the crisis again? I don't know. I feel like World War III is all they got. I mean, the first crisis we talked about was resolved with war. The second crisis we talked about was resolved with war. The third crisis was not primarily economic, so it wasn't resolved with mass destruction. But I'm asking the question, how do they resolve this crisis? And I don't know. I mean, they're trying to impose degrowth and drive down living standards as they set the stage for a low-wage police state. That's one thing that they're doing. They're escalating hostility to Russia and China. I don't know how they get out of this crisis. It's very scary. I do not know how they get out of this crisis without launching a new world war. I don't know how they get out of this crisis without setting up some kind of illiberal right-wing authoritarian state in the United States. I don't know how they get out of this without drastically reducing living standards and driving down the population. And that seems to be what the ruling class is thinking about right now. In this book, I talk about how the main danger at this point is coming from the Eastern establishment. It's coming from Silicon Valley, mainly. Silicon Valley and the Eastern establishment, they have a technocratic agenda to reduce the population, to have a very authoritarian control over what people are allowed to say, to control people's minds, and to go all out against Russia and China. They want to set up a low-wage police state at home. They want to reduce consumption and try to, stabilize capitalism by driving down living standards. And they also want to go all out against Russia and China. However, there's not even really enough unity even among themselves to pull this off. The ruling class is more divided than it's ever been. They don't have loyalty to each other at this point. They don't have a central vision. And so there's various schemes to try and stabilize capitalism for some kind of new 21st century fascism that they're thinking up and trying to impose, but they can't even get enough unity to figure that out. There's chaos within the ruling class right now. However, there is an opening for us. There's an opening for us, for those of us who believe that the United States needs a government of action to fight for working families. Those of us who believe that the future of the United States is in alliance with Russia and China and Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and the countries that have broken out of Western capitalism. Those of us who, are not looking to be degrown, but believe in growth. For those of us who are seeing an opening, I think there's a great opportunity, but it's going to require patience. It's going to require thinking outside of the box. It's going to require us breaking with the synthetic left. We should have no loyalty to the synthetic left, who are the primary foot soldiers of the Eastern establishment right now. The ultra rich, the big oil monopolists, and the tech companies, they are trying to impose a kind of degrowth fascism. The lower levels of capital are resisting it. And we have to figure out how to maneuver within this chaos to get socialism, to get a working class movement, to build an anti-monopoly coalition, to get the United States back on the path of growth. We have to figure this out. So that's the stream I wanted to give you. These are the opening remarks. I mean, we're 2 hours in, but these were the opening remarks I wanted to give you today, because I hope you're thinking about it like I am. Because this is basically, this is where we're at. They have to save their system by getting stability again, by getting economic growth going again, by saving the economy. And they have to be running scenarios in their head. How do they get society back to normal? But if you look at the crises I just went over, I don't think they can do something like that again. I don't think they can. And I think we're heading toward a very serious political crisis. And we're heading toward a moment when the role of revolutionaries, the role of people who take history into their hands, could be very important. You look at what we just did with Tsai Ing-wen, right? I confronted Tsai Ing-wen on the streets of New York City, outside of her hotel. That was a big deal. And I said, stop selling war in our country. The American people don't want war. I confronted Tsai Ing-wen. That was a big deal. And, the Global Times, one of the main newspapers in communist China, ran an interview with me. And they specifically asked me about this book. They wanted to know about this book because they're reading this book in China. People are reading this book in China. And they specifically asked me about the book in the interview. They asked me about the Center for Political Innovation and the role that we play in the United States. It's a big deal. What I did with Tsai Ing-wen, what we did, I should say, what Sam and myself and Jim and Sage, what all of us did, and Jamie, who was there, what all of us did with Tsai Ing-wen was very important. And the role of revolutionaries in the United States is very important. And the Rage Against the War Machine rally, that was watched all over the world. And the fact that last night we had a debate with libertarians, and I'll eventually post it on one of my channels. We had a debate with libertarians from that coalition, the LaRouchists, the libertarians, and myself. We had a panel, and Sam represented us as well. We had a panel. This was all very important, right? The work that we're doing now is really, really important. And I wish people could understand how important the work we're doing is now. Now is not the time for petty egos. Now is not the time for childishness. Right now, we have a very important role to play. Right. Right now, we have an important role to play. So I would urge you, if you're watching this and you like what you're hearing and you want to get involved in intervening, and if you take it seriously, right? If you don't want to just do the kindergarten communism thing and just say, oh, the problem is capitalism, workers rise up. If you actually want to be strategic and figure out how we can intervene in this mess, how we can enter strategic alliances, how we can build up our own forces. If you want to really give yourself to this, I think you should join the Center for Political Innovation. And I'm dropping the link in the chat. We need members, right? And we are trying to intervene in this crisis to save our country from the crisis of capitalism. And I would hope that you would like to get involved with us. We have meetings every Saturday on Zoom. We have regional meetups that are happening. We're going to be having another conference in Portland. The date is not set yet, and it'll be a little while. It'll probably be later in the summer or something like that. We're figuring out the details. But we just had an amazing conference in Washington, D.C. With Jyoti Brar and Peter Coffin. And, we need you. We need you in the Center for Political Innovation. This is our main theoretical document. This book is, this is an analysis of U.S. society. It talks about the crisis of capitalism, talks about Bonapartism, talks about overproduction, it talks about counter gangs and revolutionary organizations, it talks about where the United States is headed. Looks like I'll be on a show, fingers crossed, on Monday to talk about it on one of the bigger shows, fingers crossed. I'll let you know about that. But we really need you to join the Center for Political Innovation, right? Because the point is not just to talk about these things. The point is to actually do things. The point is to actually change the world, right? Karl Marx said, philosophers have long analyzed the world. The point, however, is to change it. And that's what we're doing here. We are trying to change the world, and that we're using this top-level analysis that I just gave you to try and strategically figure out how we can intervene in all of this to make society better, to make a better world. That's what we're doing. And I'd like to have you be involved in it because the point is to change it. I got to tell you, I hear it from different places now, right? And I don't know where this is coming from. Don't know where it's coming from. Because I thought it was coming from one person, but now I'm hearing it from different places. And I just want to address this right now before we do the roll call and I start answering questions. I don't know where this is coming from, but a number of people have said that in light of our organization temporarily shutting down in August, I should not organize. And I hear that, and I don't know what the hell is going through these people's minds. Why in the world would you say that to somebody? Now, maybe you don't agree with me or whatever, but why in the world would you, if you're an anti-imperialist, if you're a socialist or a Marxist, you support Russia and China against the U.S. imperialists, why would you tell somebody who also thinks that to just not do anything about it? Doesn't make any sense. For me, being a communist is all about building an organization. It's all about building a community of people to intervene in history to try and change things. That's what it's about. It's not just making ourselves feel good. It's not just, being on social media and giving commentary. The point is to actually change the world. So when I hear people say that, I really have no fucking clue what they're talking about. No clue, because I am in this because I want to change the world. I mean, this is all about building an organization. It's all about doing something. Now, if you don't want to work with me, fine. There's no one's obligating you to work with me. If you don't want to join CPI, fine. But, I am not going to stop organizing. I'll tell you that much. I am going to keep building an organization, and I'm going to keep doing the best I can to try and spread a real organization. And that building a real organization is very different than building an online community, right? The point of CPI is to build an in real life organization. And that means, we may not get as many people watching these streams as, other people get. We may not, be the center of attention at all times, but our point is to build an in real life community, a real organization, right? And so we're not going to be as theatrical and flamboyant as we might be. We're going to be very serious, and we're going to conduct ourselves in a different way. But, But we are going to keep building our organization. There is no question about that. We will keep building our organization. We will keep going. And we would love to have you if you want to join. And we have plenty of operations to carry out. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. We just had a great conference, and Peter Coffin is making a documentary about our conference that just happened. Wait until you see this documentary. It's going to be awesome. And we're just going to keep going. We are going to keep going because we're in a crisis. This is the best of times and it's the worst of times. This is a time when there's a lot of hardship and suffering in the world. There's a lot of danger hanging over our heads, but it also means that there's potential that we could actually see a socialist America come out of this. And all the revolutionaries of the past are jealous of us right now because they did not get to see a revolution. And we're in a period where if we play our cards right, if we take this seriously, we could actually see socialism come into being in America. And that would be huge. And that would be huge. So on that note, folks, I want to say hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and let's do the roll call. Let's do the roll call, and we'll call you all out as I see you. Names and locations, and I will call you out as I see you. We got DC in Cleveland, Ohio. Very good. Welcome, DC. And Lawrence Johnson in Chicago. Very, very good. We got Gavin Lockhart in Western Illinois. Rupert Fellows in England. We've got Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Very, very good. Who else is with us tonight? We got Yada Yisrael in Chicago. We got Tyler McConnell at Walmart. Shout out to Tyler. We got Restless Native, St. David's, Bermuda. We got Noah in Boston. We got Jenny in Cincinnati. Chris in Salt Lake City. Tony in Tasmania. Jamie in St. Paul. Melbourne, Australia. Heidi in Edinburgh, Scotland. Mark in Texas. Brendo in Palo Alto. We got hello from Chicago. We got Colin in Greensboro. We got Christian in Bergen County. We got Alfred in Brooklyn. We got Zephyr in Eugene, Oregon. We got Scott in Moonlight Beach. Bob Troy in New York. We got Ellie in Chicago. Shout out to you, Ellie. Right? We got Carl in Washington. We got Jenny's Basement. All right. We got Lumpia Logic, Minden out of Midwest. Shout out to you. We got Alex from Brazil. We got Patch in Arizona. We got Indiana. We got Charles Dominic from Malta. Very, very good. We had got Richmond, Virginia, Valen Undenson. Right? We got Krista in Philly. Krista, welcome, Krista. We got Mariah in North Carolina. Welcome, Mariah. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Anybody else? Names and locations. We got Michael Pino in Arizona. Welcome, Michael Pino. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Josiah Preston in Utah. Welcome, Josiah. Good to have you. Good to have you. Anybody else? We got Mohsen from Iran. Welcome, Mohsen. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Anybody else? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. I think now, maybe I'll do a few more names if they come through, but we're going to play some music. Part of the reason, by the way, I like to start playing communist music on these streams, and I know it's not going to be popular, but the kind of people that will like the music are dedicated communists. You know what I mean? And that's the interesting thing is it's like, the Cornelius Cardew music and all that is a really acquired taste. And I know that it's like not, like the streams aren't going to go viral because everyone just wants to hear that music. But this is good music. And it's good music with ideological messages. Because of that, I'm going to keep playing Cornelius Cardew music on these streams because it puts forward a good political line. And also, again, we want people on here that really take this stuff seriously. So if you are the kind of person who takes anti-imperialism seriously, you're going to love this song I'm about to play by Cornelius Cardew. It has two different names. He did it as an orchestral music piece. He called it Vietnam's Victory, but then he did this as a vocal music piece, and it's called The Law of History. I always think of Yemen when I put this song on, but it's from the quote from Mao. Mao Zedong said, the people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country, but only if they dare to rise and struggle to take up their arms and grasp the destiny of their country. So now we're going to play this great song. Oh, and Guang Li Ling is from Malaysia. We're going to play this song called Law of History by Cornelius Cardew and People's Liberation Music. And again, I like to play this kind of a music because it's for the advanced. This is the kind of music that the advanced like to hear. So here we go. All right. Like I said, Cornelius Cardew is an acquired taste. It takes a special person to appreciate that music. That is Cornelius Cardew telling us that the people of a small nation can surely defeat aggression by a big nation, but only if they dare to rise in struggle. All right. So now I've got a number of super chat questions to answer. If you want me to answer something, if you want to make a comment, you want me to respond to it, if you want me to answer a question, shoot me another super chat. I will write it down. We got a list of them to go through here. But let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and start answering super chat questions. The first super chat question came from Gavin, and it came before the show even started. And the question was, what did Chris Smalls, that's the organizer of the Amazon workers, what did he learn from William Z. Foster? Well, my understanding is that Chris Smalls read William Z. Foster's writing about how to organize steel workers. That William Z. Foster, he was the leader of the Great Steel Strike of 1919, and that he wrote a handbook for organizing in which you train workers to recruit other workers. And that according to the Financial Times and to a number of publications, that is the text by William Z. Foster that Chris Smalls was using. He was using William Z. Foster's writing on the Great Steel Strike. I have been promoting William Z. Foster like crazy on these streams. William Z. Foster, anything that William Z. Foster wrote is good. William Z. Foster was the greatest American communist. If you really want to understand the history of the communist movement, I recommend reading The History of the Three Internationals. That's this book, The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. His book, Towards Soviet America, that he wrote for his presidential campaign in 1932, is really, really good. In this new book, I quote him extensively about the anti-monopoly coalition and how it was the goal of the Communist Party to build an anti-monopoly coalition to defeat U.S. imperialism. William Z. Foster, great American communist, and that's what I draw, what Chris Smalls drew from him, and that's what I draw from him as well. Next question. In addition to pensions, do you think the French are also protesting NATO and the Ukraine war? Yes, I do think that, because what's happening now in France is a continuation of the Yellow Vest movement, which was against a gas tax that was imposed on working people to try and penalize them for using gasoline, to push kind of a green agenda. But it was also, there is right-wing kind of mobilizations, and that this is a continuation of the new right, and that there's a divide in the European bourgeoisie. And there is one wing of the European bourgeoisie, just like here. You have the Biden Eastern establishment that's tied in with Britain, and then you have the lower levels of capital that are with the Republicans or Trump. In Europe, it's the same way. The lower levels of capital are with the new right, and the upper levels are tied in with Biden and the multinational financial elite. However, in Europe, in a lot of these countries, you have a stronger labor movement, and you have much more of a tradition of protest. People feel like it's okay to go out and protest. So the new right, that's one section, but then you also have the working class that thinks if they're mad about something, they have the right to go out and protest. And that, yes, the lower levels of capital and the working class are both being pummeled by the degrowth agenda of the ultra-rich and the economic consequences of the conflict in Ukraine, what it means in terms of energy costs, what it means in terms of not being able to trade with Russia, etc. And so this is a general working class uprising in France against the conditions being imposed by the ultra-rich. And my hope is that in these countries, it'll lead to an anti-monopoly coalition of sorts, right? And that one of these countries will have an anti-monopoly coalition that'll take power and break their country out of the European Union, break their country out of NATO, break their country out of Western capitalism, enter an alliance with Russia and China to start building their country up, just like Russia and China are building their countries up. That's what we need more than anything. So, and that should be our strategy here, an anti-monopoly coalition. There we go. All right. Now, this next question. Someone says, when I hear LaRouche's idea of the American system, I feel it's not possible without taking power. So aren't they American Marxists for the 21st century? How do I put this? The LaRouche people are my good friends. You know, Daniel is awesome. Liam is awesome. So many of their people are just awesome. They're really good people. Their beliefs, I believe, are a bit esoteric. Let me just put it that way. They're right in their overall vision, right? They're understanding that Russia and China are good, that the Western capitalist financial system is bad, their belief that infrastructure should be constructed, their belief that, you know, the degrowth and their agenda of the ultra-rich for degrowth is bad. And I quote LaRouche in this book. He's in the table of contents in the new book, or he's in the bibliography, I mean. You know, and I draw from LaRouche heavily. And I would argue that, you know, in terms of the CPI, you know, I was talking with somebody about maybe doing a presentation at a future CPI event about the ideological roots of CPI. The three major influences, I would say, on CPI's worldview are William Z. Foster, Sam Marcy, and Lyndon LaRouche. And that's an odd bunch. Those are three men that you would not want to lock in an elevator together. They would kill each other, right? Foster would punch Marcy for being a dirty trot. Marcy would punch Foster for being a Stalinist, and then both of them would jump on Lyndon LaRouche and probably call him a fascist. You know, those are three men who, while they all come out of Marxism to some degree or other, you know, are very different from each other. But I have studied extensively the work of all three of those men, and I draw heavily from all three of those men's worldview. William Z. Foster, Sam Marcy, and Lyndon LaRouche. I was in the Sam Marcy organization for many years. I was in the Workers' World Party. And much of the Marcy tradition is not written down. It's like an oral tradition. But, you know, I quote from Marcy in the new book as well, and I quote from Foster. And if you want to know the three biggest influences on me ideologically are William Z. Foster, Sam Marcy, and Lyndon LaRouche. And those three guys didn't agree with each other. But back to the point. I'm sorry. How do you think Trump's second term will? You know, that said, the LaRouche people, their beliefs are very specific. They are against music that is not classical music. They have very specific beliefs about music. They also are, you know, I am mostly a Marxist materialist, but I do believe in God, and I do believe in spiritual power and energy and mind over matter to some degree or other. The LaRouche people are fully in the idealism camp. They do believe that thoughts and personalities define reality. I don't. And because they believe that, they very much believe that, you know, when we put out our new edition of Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, it took me a long time to be able to write the introduction to it. You know, and the reason for that was because, you know, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific was a polemic written by, it was a compressed version of a longer book written by Engels called Anti-Düring, right? Where is it? I have a copy here. This book was written by Frederick Engels, and it was Frederick Engels' like masterwork, Anti-Düring, Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science by Frederick Engels. And it was basically Engels took Düring, this German socialist named Düring, who was a very popular German socialist named Düring, and he contrasted Karl Marx's socialism with Düring's, and he wrote this full-length book called Anti-Düring. So then they compressed it into a short pamphlet called Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. That's like an introduction to Marxist thought. Düring's views, you know, are a lot closer to LaRouche's views. Düring was a follower of the economist Friedrich List, and what they call the American economic system, American economics, is very much, you know, it is Friedrich List, the German economist, and it is Henry Charles Carey, the American economist. Düring was a follower of Friedrich List. Now, there's a big difference. List denounced anti-Semitism and ethnic bigotry. Düring was anti-Semitic. But so, you know, I mean, LaRouche, I've never seen anything from LaRouche promoting anti-Semitism or promoting Düring. So please don't misunderstand that. But Listian economics, the main thing about List and Düring is that they believe in the power of ideas, and that they very much see socialism as something that's good for everybody, right? And that they reject the notion of class struggle. They argue that, you know, we're going to put forward ideas, the power of ideas. They see socialism coming into being as a result of the power of ideas. Whereas Marxists generally see socialism coming into being as the result of struggle between different material forces. But, and this is where it gets all tricky, right? Ideas and the conscious intervention of people with ideas can play a very important role, right? Ultimately, it is material forces. You know, it is material forces that drive forward history, not ideas. However, the intervention of conscious people with ideas is very important. So they have more or less a more idealist view. They believe that their ideas, the American system, you know, that you know, a society, a government that balances a harmony of interests and ensures economic growth, can be created on the basis of the power of ideas. I would argue that there is a struggle between the workers and the capitalists that have different economic interests. There's a struggle between U.S. imperialism and imperialism, the global imperialist system, and the forces of resistance to it that have different direct material interests. And that the ideas the LaRouche people point to as the oligarchical ideas, right? You know, Malthusianism, etc. These ideas are based on the material interest of the financial oligarchs. It's not that they have bad ideas. It's that their position, they're trying to stay at the top of the pyramid, and that they come up with these ideas to justify their material interests, and that it's in the material interest of the working class and in the global resistance and the global anti-imperialist movement. It's in their material interest to resist that. And that it's not that the ideas that we see, communism, anti-imperialism, 21st century socialism on the one side, and Malthusianism and globalism and degrowth on the other side. These are both ideas that represent the material interests of two distinct groups, right? The ideas didn't create the material interest. The material interest created the ideas. And I largely view that. Now, I do believe in the power of ideas and that an individual can step in. I'm not a 100% materialist, but my understanding of the fight in the world today is largely one rooted in materialism and economic forces. I see imperialism as one economic force, anti-imperialism as another. I see the interest of the working class on the one side and the imperialists on the other side. The LaRouche people see it as a battle of ideas. They see it as a battle between the oligarchical view of mankind that comes from Aristotle and the progressive view, or the Socratic or Platonic worldview. They see it as mainly a battle of ideas. I don't see it that way. You know, and that they argue that LaRouche, through his understanding of how to reinvent the way people think, and they have their own views that are quite esoteric. And on that basis, you know, they reject music that's not classical. They actually have some very specific ideas about Christianity and about God that are very, very specific. You know, and I respect them, and I've drawn a lot from their worldview, but ultimately I don't agree with it. And I've told this to Daniel, and Daniel and I have had many conversations about this, and that they're right about a lot. And the reason that they have been canceled is because LaRouche was too smart for the left. I mean, we saw during the Cold War, during the 60s, the left just became foot soldiers of the most evil capitalists of the Eastern establishment to push Malthusianism and degrowth. LaRouche saw that. He became aware of that, and he raised the alarm. Well, you're not allowed to do that. And the left is a clique. I'm sorry. It is a clique, right? The left forum. And it's like, I listened to old recordings of LaRouche where he talks about the people that were running the left back then. And it's the same now, right? The same now. Certain people, they get to be in charge, and you're either with them or against them, and they don't respect you. And LaRouche was not one of them. You know, LaRouche never went to college. right? He was self-taught. Well, you can't do that. No, you got to go to NYU and you got to study under this professor and learn all about the right buzzword. No, he didn't do that. LaRouche was a smart guy who was a very skilled, I believe he was an advertising consultant for a shoe company. And he was very skilled, and he was in the Socialist Workers' Party for a while, and he had his own understanding of Marxism, and he just started giving his own classes. And he taught an understanding of it that was rooted in economic growth, that was rooted in economics. And eventually he moved away from Marxism and adopted the views of Friedrich List and of Henry Carey and all of that. But he was not part of the club. And when he was a Marxist, it's like, how dare you not be part of the club? It's kind of like how the Communist Party hates me. How dare you? How dare you exist and not be part of us, right? We own Marxism. We have it copyrighted. You're not allowed to do that, Caleb. Well, yeah, I can. Yeah, I can. And LaRouche could too. And that's the fact that they're so awful like that. There you go. If you're going to tell me I'm wrong, you need to prove it. You need to tell me how I'm wrong, Tom. Tell me how I'm wrong, right? Prove it. Prove how wrong I am. All right, next question. All right. The January 6th were criminal LARPers. Don't be fascists, guys. Well, that's the next super chat. And here's the thing. First of all, were they criminal? Yeah, there were plenty of illegal things that happened on January 6th, but we now know that there were feds who helped it to happen, who helped those things to happen. And a lot of the people that have been arrested were not doing anything criminal. Some of them were, but they were led to do those criminal things and enabled to do them, with the help of federal agencies. They were entrapped. Not all of them, but because there was so much dishonesty about that day, and because there was so much manipulation to make the events happen the way they did, because of that, there needs to be a blanket amnesty. Well, that doesn't mean we think everyone there is innocent. We don't just mean we think everyone there is not criminal, but there needs to be a blanket amnesty. Second, LARPers. LARP means live action role play. That is what it means. It refers to people who put on costumes and dress up like their favorite characters from Dungeons and Dragons or Star Trek or whatever. That's what LARPing means. And when we talk about communist LARPing, we mean people who dress up in the Mao costumes or pretend they're like gorillas and stuff like that. The January 6th people were not LARPing. They were not dressing up like something they were not. They definitely were Trump supporters. They definitely were Republicans. They were dressed as Republicans. LARPing is when you pretend to be something you are not, when you dress up in a costume and pretend to be something you're not. I mean, okay, good point. Right. QAnon shaman was LARPing. All right, I'll give you that. You're right. You're right, Noah. Noah's got a very good point. QAnon shaman was LARPing. Everybody else, though, other than the guy who was actually wearing a stupid costume, the others were not LARPing necessarily. They were engaging in adventurous and semi-criminal and in some cases criminal activity, and we don't endorse that. But we know federal agencies helped it happen, so there you go. Don't be fascists, guys. Wait a second. So because, how does this follow? The fact that we want the government to release some people who were set up by criminal agencies. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, the idea that we were, we want people to be let out of jail makes us fascists. Yeah, you're wrong. Wrong. All right. And I call for freedom for every Black Panther, Jamil Al-Amin, Mumia Abu-Jamal. I support Leonard Peltier. And in my speech recently, my speech at the conference, I went into great detail about all of our support for Black revolutionary political prisoners. And yeah, if I'm going to be ideologically consistent, the victims of COINTELPRO all need to be released. And so do the victims of modern day entrapment. This was a fight within the ruling class. They set up January 6th to be an event that they could use to suppress all protests. And based on that, now that we know the events were manipulated the way they were, there needs to be an amnesty. All right, next question. Is Israel too weak to deal with the axis of resistance? Well, sure. I mean, if Israel was strong enough, they would have just gone to crush Iran, and they would have destroyed Syria already. They would have destroyed the Yemeni people and their resistance. But, Israel is right now having a big internal crisis, right? On the one hand. And on the other hand, the anti-imperialist forces in the Middle East that are centered around the axis of resistance, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthi Ansar Allah movement, they are very strong, and they have enough military force to stop Israeli attacks. What Israel's doing with the Al-Aqsa mosques, what they've been doing to the Palestinians recently is horrendous. I mean, it's unjustified, and I mean, I'm in New York City, the center of dumb Zionists, and we'll have to see what happens next, especially since Israel's so internally divided. It almost looks to me like they're trying to fight the Palestinians to diffuse the internal contradictions in Israel right now. So there you go. There you go. All right. Michael Hudson theorized that the USA entered the war to save the British financial system. That's true, because Germany was winning and they had a socialist government. Well, they didn't have a socialist government. They did have more of a militarized government, right? The Kaiser did create a national health service, and the Kaiser, there was a lot more state control in the German economy, but it wasn't socialism. It was military capitalism, right? And that, yes, the war was very much, it was that British financial system, fighting against the Germans, and the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans. I mean, that part's true. And it was the British financial system fighting a rival faction among the imperialists. But I wouldn't call Germany socialist. It was social democracy was very powerful in Germany before World War I. But it wasn't a socialist country. It was a Germany was an imperialist country before World War I. No question about it. It was, yeah, again, I mean, a lot of people, why do we have kindergarten? Why do we have kindergarten? Why do we have that? Well, why do we, why is a German word, right? Germany introduced kindergarten, and they introduced public education, because it was the Kaiser and the German imperialism wanted to, train the kids to be soldiers. And so Germany had public education before the United States did. And they didn't start having guaranteed public education for all kids in the United States really until like 1900. Now, we know about one-room schoolhouses and all of that. And there were schools in different parts of the United States, but a lot of immigrant children didn't go to school. I mean, it was, around the time of 1900, a lot of those kids who came off the boat from Italy and Lithuania and Eastern Europe and Ireland, they didn't get to go to school. They worked in a factory, and a lot of them didn't speak English, so the schools wouldn't take them and stuff. And we didn't get universal compulsory public education in this country until like 1900. And that came because the Germans did it first, because the Germans created it, because the Kaiser wanted to train the kids to be good soldiers, and because the Social Democratic Party, led by Karl Kautsky, led protests demanding build schools for our kids. And that's what I talk about when you talk about the Second International and social imperialism, is that on the one hand, Marxism in Germany was about fighting for the working class. But on the other hand, German imperialism was able to kind of use that to stabilize imperialism. So the working class are out protesting in Germany, led by this huge Marxist party, the Social Democratic Party, give schools to our kids. And the Kaiser, the imperialist bourgeoisie of Germany, says, okay, we can do that, and we'll give them military training. And so, the Kaiser put, and the German schools prior to World War I, the kids, it was like it was like military training. The schools they were marching all the time. And that's why if you watch the Nazi movie, the Triumph of the Will, which is a Nazi propaganda film, it was made by Leni Riefenstahl. It's considered to be one of the best films of the 1930s. I mean, the message is obviously horrendous, but it's a Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Will. The movie ends with a big parade that goes on for like 20 minutes. And you watch that big parade and it's like really boring, because it's just like the rest of the film is quite gripping and exciting despite the disgusting message. But you watch Triumph of the Will, but then at the end there's just this parade that goes on for hours and hours and hours. Well, if you watch Triumph of the Will, the reason there's a big parade at the end is because Hitler was saying to the population, your childhood is back. Germany had been a much stronger country. World War I had destroyed it. And Hitler's saying the happy days are here again. Remember when you were a kid marching back and forth in school? Well, now you're back. Now you've got it again. That's basically what Hitler was saying. So the marching had a psychological power, right? After World War I, Germany had been stripped of its colonies. And Germany had not been allowed to have a military. And so they stopped having military training in schools. They stopped having military stuff. But prior to World War I, soldiers marching had been such a big part of kids in school were marching every day. They had, military parades all the time. And so that big parade at the end of the Triumph of the Will is Hitler trying to say the good old days of your childhood before Germany went to hell, they're back. That's what he's saying in the film, right? And that's what he's saying in the film. And that's what he's trying to say. And that, yeah, Germany prior to World War I had a highly militarized economy, and it had social programs like a national healthcare service, like public education. And, you know, even though that was fought for and won by the German working class and the Social Democratic Party, it was a way of stabilizing imperialism. And that's the whole point, you know, of Lenin's imperialism and the split in socialism, is that even though the Marxist movement of Europe intended one thing, the imperialists kind of watered it down and turned it into a mechanism for saving their system. So there you go. There you go. All right. Now this is, someone wrote, man must change or die, a la Christ Buddha. Not quite sure what that means. I will say that, yesterday I did begin my remarks at the debate that the LaRouchites hosted by honoring Good Friday, the day that Christ was crucified. I also honored Passover, which is, the Jewish holiday that was on Wednesday, I believe, was Passover. So that just happened. And also Friday was the day of Al-Quds, which is the day Muslims around the world protest against Israel's crimes. So Friday was quite an important day for those who practice Abrahamic religions, be they Muslim, Jewish, or Christian. And so I made a point of honoring that out of respect for those folks. And I'm going to tweet this out later. I can't get over this. So tomorrow is Easter, right? Easter. I mean, it's, unless you're Orthodox. If you're Orthodox, Easter's in a couple weeks. But if you're a Protestant or Catholic, Easter is tomorrow. And so I'm at the gym today. Finally got to go back to the gym. I've been so busy and doing so many things and recovering from all the stuff. Finally went back to the gym today. So I'm at the gym. I'm working out on the treadmill, and I'm on the elliptical machine, and I'm working out. And I look over at CNN. Tomorrow, CNN is going to run a documentary about the Heaven's Gate cult. Right? It was this religious group that committed suicide because of a spaceship or some shit in the 90s. I was a kid. Awful thing, obviously. And I thought, wow. What are the chances that on a day when millions of Americans are going to pile into church to hear about somebody who was canceled, somebody who was spit on and demonized and killed for defying and standing up to the authorities of his day, who was killed and then rose again from the dead, proving the immortality of revolution and the immortality of the struggle for justice and goodness in the world against the forces of evil. Millions of people are going to pile into church on Sunday morning to hear that there is right and wrong in this world. There is truth and justice in this world. To hear about somebody who endured horrendous persecution, was killed for it, but then became immortal. What are the chances that night, CNN, just randomly, that night, they're going to run one of these stupid Steve Hassan anti-cult documentaries? What are the chances? It's obvious what the ruling class is doing, right? They are pushing philosophical irrationalism, the idea that there is no truth, there is no right and wrong, all causes are phony, anyone who believes in anything is a sucker. That's what they're doing. They're trying to deprogram Easter. That's what they're doing. I mean, there's a reason. They didn't have to run this documentary. Why in the world would, of a random event that happened in the 90s, right, of a cult suicide, of all the days to show it, they're showing it on Easter. They're trying to psychologically deprogram Easter, right? Because millions of Americans, I when I was a kid, I remember the church was always full on Christmas Eve and it was always full on Easter, right? There's a lot of Christians who only go to church on Christmas and Easter. And, a lot of people are going to go to church tomorrow and they're going to hear a message. They're going to hear a message that is the exact opposite of the philosophical irrationalism that's pumped on Americans. And so, they're trying to deprogram that. And they're trying to, it's like they're going to hear that it's worth going out and sacrificing for right and wrong. It's, they're going to hear a message that's not like a communist message. I mean, most churches push a quite conservative message, but they're going to hear illiberalism tomorrow. And so they're going to run a postmodernist, philosophical irrationalist, don't be in a cult, don't believe in anything, or else you're being brainwashed. And they'll bring on Steve Hassan on there is going to say, yes. And, these people that killed themselves, a lot of them thought that like truth existed. And a lot of them like believed it was right. I mean, it's obvious what they're doing. Obviously that Heaven's Gates group was disgusting. And I mean, it was a wacky group, and wacky groups exist, and they've always existed throughout history. But there's a reason that on Easter, they're going to highlight that. Right. And they're using Heaven's Gate, not just as an attack on Christianity, but as an attack on all illiberalism, because they're pushing postmodernism and philosophical irrationalism. They're pushing Leo Strauss and Friedrich Nietzsche. So that's what they're doing. That is what they are doing. And it's evil what they're doing. I mean, they know what they're doing. The ruling class is very terrified that any kind of mass illiberal movement could form that could threaten their power. That's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that some kind of mass illiberal movement could emerge that could threaten the power of the capitalists. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what they're doing. They picked Easter to show it on. I am convinced that's what they did. And I'm going to tweet about that later. I just don't have Twitter on my phone, so I have to email the image of the TV screen that I took to I don't have Twitter on my phone because I don't want to lose my mind. So there you go. All right. Next question. All right. Can modern Russia be considered as formidable of a rival with the USA as the Soviet Union? What does that mean? I mean, clearly Russia, is a big opponent of the United States on the global stage. Russia is aligned with various anti-imperialist countries. Obviously things have changed. Russia is not a socialist society anymore. It's not led by a Marxist-Leninist party. I mean, why do you ask me that? Like, what are you getting at? Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, am I supposed to, I mean, that's, I get a lot of questions on here, and it's like, okay, like, what am I supposed to say there? Right? I mean, do you want me to be like, no, Russia sucks now compared to the Soviet Union? Or do you want me to say the opposite and be like, no, the Soviet Union sucks compared to modern Russia? It's like, it's different, right? It's like, it's just a weird question. It's just an odd question to ask me. Like, it's just different. It's just different, right? There is a global anti-imperialist movement that's changed. The Soviet Union was amazing. It defeated Hitler. It invented space travel. It wiped out illiteracy. It raised millions of people out of poverty. It gave birth to a global movement that was heroic against racism and led to anti-colonial heroic struggles of people all across the planet. Soviet Union had amazing achievements. Modern Russia is not the Soviet Union, but it's also done amazing things. Putin has fixed Russia's economy by recentering it around oil and natural gas to state-controlled energy companies. Russia has done a lot to, deal with the legacy and the problems of the Yeltsin era in the 90s. Russia is aligned with the communist countries of the world, and it's friendly to China. It's friendly to Venezuela and Cuba, and, it has... I mean, it's different, right? The Soviet Union fell for a reason. You can't just restore the Soviet Union because it fell for a reason. Modern Russia, on the other hand, is what exists under these circumstances. It is an anti-imperialist, revolutionary country that is opposing the imperialists. It's not Marxist-Leninist. It's not socialist. But I mean, what do you want me to say? Like, questions like that perplex me, but it's fine. I'll answer any super chat I get for the most part. So there you go. BlackRock is destroying California. Working class people cannot afford the rent. Yes, the ultra rich have no place for us in their system. And BlackRock is a big part of the British financial system. It's pushing degrowth on the world, trying to impoverish people. BlackRock is an enemy of the working class of the American people. It's an enemy of working families around the world. So there you go. All right. Where does the claim that MLK was a communist come from? Well, the main thing is there's this billboard they made that said Martin Luther King Jr. was at a communist training school. And what that was is that Martin Luther King Jr. went to some kind of civil rights training center or something that had historically had something to do with CPUSA. He made an appearance there because he was the leader of the civil rights movement, and there was some kind of, I forget, it was like a folk singing play, like I don't know, it was like a folk arts academy or something. It was like a place, it was like a building that historically some of the people who'd started it had been in CPUSA. So they said that Martin Luther King Jr. went to a communist training school. That's not accurate. Martin Luther King went to a building that was associated with folk music and left-wing art, and there were people in the Communist Party USA who'd been involved with starting the place. You know, Pete Seeger was in the Communist Party. Woody Guthrie was not a member, but he was like friendly to the Communist Party. So, I mean, that's that. The other thing was that there were a couple people who were in Martin Luther King Jr.'s inner circle who had been in the Communist Party before. One of the main people was Bayard Rustin. I don't know if people know the name Bayard Rustin, but Bayard Rustin was a civil rights leader who had been in the Communist Party USA in the 30s. He became a Trotskyite social democrat, you know, in the 60s. He was actually, he even supported the Vietnam War. He was very much not a revolutionary, but he was also gay. And he was known to be gay, Bayard Rustin. And because Bayard Rustin had been in the Communist Party a long time ago, and because he was known to be gay, Bayard Rustin was kind of forced to play a behind-the-scenes role in the civil rights movement because, you know, if he was the main guy, then they would say, oh my God, the civil rights movement is a gay communist group or something. They were already calling it communist. But yeah, Martin Luther King Jr. was good friends with Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin wrote a lot of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches, stuff like that. So because of that, you know, because Martin Luther King Jr. hung out with Bayard Rustin, he was considered to be, oh, he's hanging out with this gay communist guy. At one point, this is fascinating to me. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin shared a hotel room, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took a bath and he sat in the bathtub, and Bayard Rustin sat on the toilet and they were talking. The FBI had a hidden camera in the hotel room. True story. True story. The FBI had a hidden camera in the hotel room, took a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. in the bathtub while Bayard Rustin is sitting on the toilet and the two of them are talking, and said that Martin Luther King Jr. is gay. And they sent the photograph to a bunch of magazines. So just put that in your pipe and smoke it. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. You know, that because Martin Luther King Jr. was in the bathtub and Bayard Rustin was sitting on the toilet and they shared a hotel room one time, and the FBI, you know, took a photo of this with a hidden camera. Based on that, they said that MLK was gay and they tried to destroy his reputation. So there you go. You know, and they went after MLK over his private life. I mean, you know, MLK was not a communist. Towards the end of his life, he became a very social democratic thinker. But he was always an anti-communist, right? And even if you read the Beyond Vietnam speech and a lot of the stuff he says, criticizing capitalism, he never goes as far as straight up saying communism is right. It's kind of like, it's like, we need to become really, really socialistic, or something like that. You know, we need to become really, really social democratic and peace loving in order to prevent, you know, communism, which is bad, from spreading. So yeah, I mean, but MLK, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, he was moving in that direction. Who knows where he would have been if he'd lived, right? I mean, if he had not been killed, is it possible that he would have become even more radical? Sure. I mean, he was considering a presidential run. At the time of his death, he was going to run for president on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. We know that. He was also leading huge anti-poverty protests, Resurrection City, and he was focusing on economics at the time of his death. He was saying that poverty was the main issue and that the way to unite poor people, of black and white, was to focus on economic justice. His final book is called Where Do We Go From Here? And it calls for a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens. So it's possible that, who knows what could have happened, but he was killed. He was killed, and that's that. So there we go. Next question. All right. The Taft-Hartley Law and the Powell Memo. Well, the Taft-Hartley Law is an anti-labor law that was passed in 1948. President Truman, the Democrat, tried to veto it, but they overrode his veto. Amid McCarthyism in the United States, they used the anti-communist sentiment to build up anti-labor feelings, right? And then Hollywood also worked hard. There was a movie called On the Waterfront that came out that said that unions were corrupt, portrayed unions as if they were all run by the mob and they're corrupt. And there was a lot of feeling, a lot of propaganda after the post-war strike wave of 1946. There was a feeling that these labor unions, they're out of control, they're strike happy, and they're out of control. And so in that atmosphere, they passed the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law. The Taft-Hartley anti-labor law has a lot of parts of it that are shocking, that in any other country, people would say it's a violation of civil liberties, if not workers' rights. What is a strike? What is a strike? A strike is withholding your labor. You're just saying, hey, I ain't going to work. You don't pay me, right? No contract, no work. You're not doing what I want. You're not offering. And libertarians, gotta love them. Libertarians, we got to learn to deal with them, but they can be annoying sometimes. Libertarians always love to fall back on that. Well, there shouldn't be a minimum wage. If they don't pay you enough, just don't do it. Just don't take the job. Duh. It's like they have this they don't understand how things work. Everyone who gets paid a low wage is just stupid. Just don't work there if they don't pay you. Duh. It's like that's how libertarians think, right? It's just classic, right? But that's what striking is, right? They're not paying you enough, so you don't work until you get paid what you're owed, right? That's what it's supposed to be. If you believe in the libertarian mindset of, the government shouldn't regulate everything, people should just, vote with their dollars, right? That's what people, when they go on strike, that's what they're doing. I ain't gonna work. You don't give me what I want. You don't sign the contract the way I want. I ain't going to work. That's what a strike is. Well, the Taft-Hartley law says you can only strike over issues in your own workplace. It forbids what's called solidarity strikes. It used to be that, if the factory was on strike, the truck drivers who pick up the goods from the factory would also go on strike. It used to be that, that if the janitors at the factory went on strike, the factory workers would also go on strike. I mean, it used to be what was called solidarity strikes were very common. And that if one union went on strike, other unions would go on strike to hurt the company that was hurting the workers who originally went on strike. Well, the Taft-Hartley law makes that illegal, and it gives employers the right to sue labor unions for unfair business practices if they violate that. If they do have solidarity strikes, that's horrendous. The other thing is the Taft-Hartley law gives the President of the United States the right to order workers back to work. It's called a cooling off period. And it basically says the president can go to any labor union at any time and say, go back to work, right? Under threat of arrest, right? That's unbelievable. The idea, the feeling was that, what if, the country is in the middle of a war? Because during the Korean War, the steel workers talked about going on strike, and President Truman and others were not happy about this. They said that might hurt the war effort to have a steel strike. So the idea was to give the president the ability, if, during the Korean War, he was worried about a steel strike, the president could just point at the steel workers and say, go to work or we arrest you. There's that. The other thing is that the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law, it got rid of, it used to be that if 51% of the workers in any workplace agreed to form a union, it was automatically unionized. Now, the Taft-Hartley law says, no, the National Labor Relations Board has to go in and oversee a union election, which then means that it can be up to 2 years before they actually have a vote on whether the union gets to go in. I mean, it becomes this whole bureaucratic process where it used to be if 51% of the people at a company signed a card, unionized. The Taft-Hartley anti-labor law, it's pretty awful. It's a pretty awful piece of legislation, and it's weakened the labor movement very significantly. I will say, though, that the labor movement is led by forces that didn't resist it properly. If the labor movement were led by communists, that law would have been overturned a long time ago. They don't have such laws. In countries like France and Mexico and places like that, they don't have that law because the labor unions are stronger because they're led by Marxists, or have been. Now, unfortunately, the labor unions are, since the 50s, have been led by social democrats and reformists. And because of that, the labor movement has been significantly weaker. And it hasn't fought, right? And that's part of the thing. The communists, when they were leading the labor movement, they had an ideology, like a class struggle kind of ideology, right? Where their focus was, like, we're going to fight the employers, right? Yeah. Right. All right. So there you go. 1 second. But yeah, so, the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law, the Powell memo, that's, that was neoliberal economics. And that was an effort to, to push back workers' rights and stuff. And that, that was part of the neoliberalism starting in the early 1970s. There was, especially culminating with the, like I went over all that history when talking about Nixon and all of that. So, oh boy. Very good. Anyway, next question. I'm getting tired, but that's okay. Do you think LBJ was involved in JFK's death? No, I don't, because it would be way too obvious, right? I think, probably the forces that were involved in killing Kennedy trusted LBJ more, but the idea that he was directly involved, that would be, why would he do that? No, I don't think so. I think there were other forces that were involved, but I really doubt that LBJ was directly himself personally involved in signing on to it. In my opinion, the capitalists won't enact reforms to save capitalism. The dollar will drop. Well, Noah, is it Noah who asked that, or was it Mariah? Well, I'll just tell you what I think. They will have to enact some reforms to make money again. They're not concerned about like saving the system in the long term. They're concerned about making money. Right now, ultimately, the ultra rich have more managerial perspective, and they hire people like Brzezinski and others that try to think about saving the system in the long term. But at the end of the day, they're concerned about making money. Part of these reforms that they try to enact, that Bonapartist figures try to enact, it's about getting the economy going again so that their profits can rise. Because when you have an economic downturn like the one we have, the capitalists are losing money. So they are going to have to enact some kind of reforms in order to make money again. However, the question is, what reforms will they enact, and who the reforms they enact will benefit some capitalists and hurt others. And the fight in the ruling class is about who will benefit from these reforms and who will be hurt by them. Roosevelt, the reforms he enacted benefited the Eastern establishment and the oil companies, and they weakened the factory owners. That's why the National Association of Manufacturers was the main group promoting fascism and opposing Roosevelt. And that's why Rockefeller and some of those forces were the forces supporting Roosevelt. There was a division in the ruling class, right? That, if Roosevelt had been defeated, the Republican would have carried out reforms that would have benefited the factory owners, but probably come at the expense of the oil companies and the oil bankers. Right. And that there are divisions in the ruling class. They're going to have to do something to try and stabilize their system. The question is what? War, right? War, military intervention. That's one thing they do to stabilize their system. Military spending is another thing they do. There's all kinds of different things that can be done, but they require stepping on some capitalists in order to get the economy going. The only way we can get the economy going again, and none of these measures are long-term, right? They're all Bonapartist maneuvers are only short-term fixes. They never ultimately solve the problem. And in this book, the second chapter of this book, I talk about Nazi Germany. I talk about Roosevelt. I talk about Woodrow Wilson. I talk about Abraham Lincoln. I talk about Bonapartism. The second chapter of this book, I talk about the original Bonapartist, Louis Bonaparte. I explain Bonapartism and what drives Bonapartist reforms and maneuvers. I talk about that in a lot of great detail because it's very important. It's very important, and Marx's analysis of what happened in France in 1850, in 1851, 52. I mean, Bonapartism, it's not that I think there will be some reforms. I mean, Trump, and what did Trump do to try and get the economy going again? He deregulated deep sea drilling. He deregulated fracking. He deregulated Wall Street. He passed all kinds of deregulations so that more money would flow into the lower levels of capital. That's what he did. And he increased military spending. That's what Donald Trump did, right? And he escalated military spending around the world, and he deregulated the oil industry to help the little oil companies. The big oil companies want more regulation because then they get to write the rules. That's the little oil companies that lose out, right? And it was for the little oil companies, the frackers and the lower level oil companies, a lot of little oil companies in Texas, they benefited from it. Big oil wants to restrict oil output. They want oil scarcity. Donald Trump, what did Obama do? Well, Obama did Obamacare, right? Which was it was a great benefit to the big insurance companies. I mean, they got to write the law practically. Obama did Dodd-Frank, which benefited the big banks, but didn't benefit the lower level Wall Street guys, right? They all want reforms to some degree or other, but it's a question of who will the reforms benefit and who will they step on? Obama stepped on lower level capitalists. He stepped on the little oil companies to benefit big oil. He stepped on the lower level Wall Street guys to benefit the big Wall Street guys. And Trump, on the other hand, he pushed back against the big higher levels of capital to benefit the lower levels, right? And but the government has to do something when the economy is bleeding. It has to do something. All right, next question. How do you think Trump's second term will be different, less neocons? And do you think, this is another one after that, do you think he'll be prevented from running again? I think there's a very good chance he'll be prevented from running again. The Republican Party is determined to somehow make sure he's not their candidate. And I almost think that the Democrats were trying to do a dirty to the Republican Party, but also a favor to Donald Trump by bringing charges against him, because that put him on the front page. And at the end of the day, most Republicans like Trump. If the election were held today and Trump was a candidate, he would win. But there you go. I mean, I think, there's a very good chance he won't be allowed to run again. The Republican Party, they have something up their sleeve. The Republicans they are figuring out somehow they're going to make sure that Donald Trump is not their nominee. And I think that the Democrats would like Trump to be their nominee because they are going to make sure he doesn't run. They'll bar him. I think they would like it to be Trump, and then they will make sure he doesn't win. And I think that's what the Democrats are trying to do right now. There are mechanisms that have been put in place, I am convinced, to make sure Donald Trump doesn't win the presidency again. I think it's very unlikely that Donald Trump will be allowed to be president again. It's possible. If Donald Trump did become president, it would be amped up. I think Trumpism would be on steroids because the neocons are not there. The neocons are kind of restraining him. And Trump, he's calling for the death penalty for drug importers. And he's also talking about the quantum leap. He's going to build all these cities. And I think if Donald Trump were to somehow get back into office, he would be so on the defensive, and he would have so few within the establishment behind him. He would have to do a lot of really, really dramatic stuff to be popular, basically. I think that there are mechanisms in place. I am convinced that after January 6th, the ruling class got together, and there are mechanisms in place to make sure he doesn't get elected again. But if there's a big capitalist crisis, and this is what you have to remember, if there's a huge crisis, they might consider him, right? That Bonapartist figures are generally wildly unpopular, even with the ruling class, but they're turned to when there's a big crisis, right? And also Bonapartist figures, it's not so much about how much support they have from the ruling class. They have to have support from some sections of the ruling class, but it's about their ability to build a mass movement, right? At the end of the day, right? The reason Hitler was picked was not, the reason Hjalmar Schacht, picked Hitler was because Hitler had the ability to build a mass movement to back up his Bonapartism. Louis Bonaparte, the reason Louis Bonaparte was picked to be the Bonapartist for France was he had the nostalgia of the French Revolution. He was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and he had the ability to build a mass movement. And that ultimately, when you have a Bonapartist whose job it is to save capitalism, they have to be able to foment a huge amount of public support. Donald Trump, at this point, more than any other political figure in the United States, is able to do that. Most of the ruling class would prefer he not be in, I think, but there's a small section of the ruling class that's still with him, and his ability to build a mass movement is widespread. So I think, again, if the U.S. economy continues to just completely collapse and we're having utter instability in the country, I think there's a chance that he would be taken into office. And there'd be a section of the ruling class that would fight him like hell, and, it would not come easy. But then when he came into office, he would take really, really, really dramatic moves. But I almost feel like that won't happen, because if Donald Trump was going to be Trump, he would have done that when he first came into office. I was convinced when he came in, if Donald Trump had wanted to be, the Bonapartist authoritarian strongman of the United States, what he should have done, and he just didn't have the ability to do it. I think he probably wanted to do this, is he should have made the border wall a jobs program, right? If I was Trump, that's what I would have done. Obviously, I don't support the border wall, but I'm just telling you strategically, he should have, if he had made the border wall a jobs program, hired millions and millions of people to start building that border wall. If he'd used the pandemic as an opportunity, which Donald Trump did the opposite. He couldn't even tell his supporters to wear a mask. But if Donald Trump were a fascist, he would have seen the pandemic as an opportunity, right? He would have said, well, we have to deport millions of people from the country because they're spreading disease. He would have, Donald Trump would have used the pandemic, right? Like a Reichstag fire. He didn't, right? Donald Trump actually, his response to the pandemic was to not use it, right? The more fascist wing of the ruling class are the ones who actually use the pandemic. Fascists tend to use crises. Donald Trump was a libertarian president who was resisting the fascism of the ultra rich. That's what he was. He was because he's, got a right-wing constituency, and because he's fighting dirty, he appealed to racist anti-immigrant sentiments, Islamophobia, etc. I don't even know what that is, Gleb. Is that some kind of meme or something? I'm not going to put it on the screen if it's some kind of offensive meme. I just, Donald Trump, people who say he was a fascist, he wasn't a fascist. He was a right-wing authoritarian. He wasn't even really a right-wing authoritarian. He was just, I don't know. He was a libertarian resisting. He was a libertarian, Republican, conservative, resisting the degrowth agenda of the ultra-rich and appealing to bigotry and negative sentiments and authoritarian sentiments in some sense of people to do so. But he was a failure as a president. And I feel like, again, he's going to be pretty old pretty soon. I'm not confident we're going to see a second term for Trump. It's possible, though. If it was held today, he would win, but I feel like he doesn't have the support within the ruling class. So there you go. There you go. All right, everybody. I think this is where we're going to end it for tonight. Glad we could come back with a nice long stream. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night, everybody.